DA. Chapter 41. As time passes too. Right here and now, I am not going to wait to fully become yours and make you only mine for the time I have you. With that she snapped her fingers, making her clothes aside from her lacy black bra and panties to disappear. So Percy, she said as she leaned down and nibbled his ear making him groan. Make me yours. Lemon. DA. Chapter 42. As time passes 3. She eagerly nuzzled into him with a subtle purr as their legs remained intertwined. He in turn nuzzled the top of her head as he took in her scent like a cool mountain covered in honeysuckles. He then glanced down at her body as it radiated with her afterglow making him immensely proud at satisfying her so well. He then had his eyes trail to her belly button before a sudden thought came to him. Aria, he said somewhat nervously as she looked at him with her loving eyes. Yes, she asked as she moved her face closer. Did you, use a safety spell or something? Since it completely slipped my mind, he said as he glanced down her body to get the point across. He wanted children with her sure, but certainly not yet when war was imminent. However, his worries were turned into confusion as Rhea giggled at him before explaining. No worries, I had a talk with Andy a year or so back. She made it so I can't get pregnant until she removes the spell so we're completely safe. Oh, he said dumbly as she giggled even more. Silly, of course I thought ahead for this, she said before kissing him on the nose. He chuckled before kissing her tenderly as he pulled her close. He then felt a wolfish grin form as he nibbled along her neck as his hands fell to her rear and giving a firm squeeze making her moan. Feeling like another round? He asked before biting at her ear. He suddenly felt himself lying flat as Rhea straddled him with a dangerous smirk on her face, a haughty and challenging aura coming off her. His inner wolf howled at the challenge to his dominance as his desire for her grew, only to make her submit later on. I thought you'd never ask. Another year 5 Tartarus. Two figures clashed in a massive arena, their forms moving as blurs of white and black with their every strike. The Colosseum-like building was almost empty aside from the combatants as they fought on like the very forces of nature they were. A spark in one corner, a crash at the other end of the arena, a slash mark suddenly appearing along the ground. That was the only signs of the fighters visible to most eyes aside from the one overseeing them from his seat as the ruler and owner of this arena. Tartarus watched patiently, his experienced eyes at times having difficulty tracking the movement of blades even as he followed the two fighters easily enough. He felt a pride unlike any he'd had before, looking at the results of his careful training and mentoring. Those two are ready for this war and they will only get stronger from here on out, he thought as he stood and watched as the fighters charged at each other again. They clashed in the center creating a shockwave massive enough to shake the very arena to its base, two unique blades of crystal darkness against a sword of light. Both combatants remained locked in a standstill, their strength matched at the moment but the warrior in black was slowly forcing the one in white down to a knee. Before they could go on Tartarus silently raised his hand and both fighters immediately stopped before turning to face him in respect. Tartarus nodded in approval before flashing before them, taking them in with a critical eye. The fighter in black was Percy, dressed in his usual coat of darkness morphed into a sleeveless muscle shirt and black leather pants, Sin and Purgatory resting at ease in his hands by his sides. The fighter in white was Jason, dressed in a similar white muscle shirt, his own unique jacket of light formed into a biker fashion formed after he claimed his right to be an heir, light gray jeans, and lightly tanned boots. In his hands was his sword, Revelation, a weapon formed of Tartarian steel and solid light ore obtainable only in the realm of the heavens with Ether's help. It was forged into the fashion of a European longsword with a hand and a half grip, a core and handle of the Tartarian steel with the body of the blade being formed from the solid light. Both fighters radiated immense power the likes of which would make the Olympians and Titans alike cower in fear. The last 2 years of training for the three newest had been brutal as they needed to catch up to Percy, Andromeda, and Rhea but now that gap was only marginal. Percy was still the strongest while Rhea and Jason were more or less even, followed by Andromeda and Talia matching each other and Nico was the last behind but the requirements of him becoming an heir were more complicated so as of now he was the only one not to claim being an heir yet. As for the rest of their forces, the training had been very successful. It was trickier with those needing to be seen on Olympus but with a few minor charms thanks to the efforts of Nyx and Hecate, their increases in power were well hidden. Even his disappointing son, Damison, had become an accomplished fighter and a usual sparring partner of Hercules. His immense size and strength meant he was one of the few who could fight fist to fist with the god of strength, while his intelligence and strategy kept Hercules on his feet. Others that had become good friends and fighting partners had been Leto, Phoebe, Lamia, and Medusa, since each had a different preferred weapon and style while fighting in battle royals. Overall, their forces were coming along nicely, and soon it would be the time to act. He could tell that Percy and Rhea were particularly antsy about getting Hestia here, but could it be done now? He scanned Percy intently as the pair finally sat and recovered after their spar that had been raging for nearly 3 days, with both using a multitude of skills they helped each other create. One particularly deadly ability both used was becoming partially darkness, light, as they move around at a pace even Nyx and Ether couldn't keep up with, while the two could still attack and weave through multiple opponents. He could fight his way out with her easily, but then again, giving the Olympians sign of their rise could be problematic as well, he thought before he noticed a presence approaching. Jason and Percy sensed it too as they looked away for a moment just before Nyx flashed in. "Hello boys," Nyx greeted as she looked around before her eyes focused on Percy. "Hello Lady Nyx," Jason, the ever formal, replied while Percy just waved with a smile. "Hey Nyx, what can we do for you?" Percy asked as he turned his swords back into rings, while Jason with the same, but his sword turned into a white gold watch instead. "Oh, it's not what you can do for me, it's what I can do for you," she replied, making Percy raise an eyebrow. Noting his look, she elaborated, "It's time." Time for what exactly?" Percy asked with narrowing eyes. "To get your little goddess back," Nyx replied, making Percy's eyes widen. "Ah, really?" Percy asked with a hopeful glint. "Sister, are you sure?" Tartarus asked as he faced his sister. "I am," she replied seriously. "If he does it now, he can still hide his power beneath the charm, so the Olympians won't know what he is, and if Rhea goes with him in the form of Mira and Umbra, it will throw Olympus off the trail." "So how are we going to do this?" Percy asked eagerly, making Nyx smirk. "Why, a public kidnapping, of course." D.A. Chapter 43. Hope Comes Home. Hestia slowly walked along the streets of Olympus as she headed in the direction of the throne room. Her face was near blank, her orange eyes lacking the usual fire in them. Over a decade had passed since Percy left, and she still missed him as much, if not more. His smile, his mischievous smirk, those deep sea-green eyes and unruly hair, but most importantly his warmth. He had been like a walking beacon of hope and courage, always striving for the better future against all odds. It was that and how he felt just before he left that made her feel so cold and lonely without him. It seemed that with his disappearance, tragedy after tragedy followed suit, and most of them were from the Olympians' actions. The council had fallen apart to the point most looked at each other with open hostility or indifference. Poseidon rarely attended meetings anymore or moved from Atlantis, and she hadn't spoken directly to him in all this time. Tensions between Apollo and Athena were at a near constant high ever since he was caught cheating on Annabeth, his wife. She grimaced at the memory of the wedding, knowing it was more of a political play on Zeus' part and power grab from Annabeth with her mother's backing. With Annabeth's marriage, the demigods who respected her and didn't know about her betrayal to Percy saw it as a hope for a better tomorrow. One of their own had succeeded in reaching Olympus and having a happy ending, gaining loyalty to Olympus and bringing the Apollo and Athena cabins closer together, until the affair that was. The godly politics had spilled into both camps, with the respective children at each other's throats during war games and such. At this point Hestia was wondering if Annabeth would ever have a repeat of what she did to Percy and have an affair, but then again her pride wouldn't let herself be brought down to a place similar to Aphrodite in that regard, so Apollo was safe from that particular rage that he would doubtlessly have if any man dared touch Annabeth that wasn't him. Hypocrites the lot of them, Hestia thought as she recalled Poseidon's words on Sally and how she was no longer his concern just because she'd moved on with her life. Otherwise there was the infiltration of Artemis' hunt, the kidnapping of Andromeda, and slaughter of Phoebe. She'd seen the state of the body in a memory projection since Artemis had been too distraught to even speak during that emergency meeting, so all the Olympians got a prime view of the carnage left behind by this Umbra. Aphrodite had to leave from feeling sick at the sight with Dionysus close behind her. That event hadn't helped the tensions at all, and Artemis had the gall to try and come to Hestia for comfort. Never before had Hestia outright rejected someone in need, but she didn't even flinch as she told Artemis to leave her and closed her palace doors in her once favorite niece's face. Things got quiet for a few years then, Hestia simply remaining silent as she watched her family decay by the day as they got angrier with each other and made their heroes angrier as well, which ultimately went back to them. It was a vicious cycle of self-perpetuating hate. Then disaster struck again in a mere 3 days with the revelation of Piper cheating on Jason, thanks to the meddling of Aphrodite, the defeating of Apollo, and then disappearance of Jason but Nico as well, and finally Talia leaving the hunt as well. That had been particularly nasty since Talia had openly revealed how Artemis got around her oath, making several Olympians lose faith in the huntress, and soon enough all of Olympus knew. The twins had become laughing stocks after that week, one for being defeated so soundly without any clue as to what happened, and Artemis for even further losses to her hunt, as well as the remaining failures of tracking down Percy or Umbra. Aphrodite was a wreck still after losing her relationship to her favored daughter. Ares was even more irritable. Zeus spent the meetings between scolding a silent Artemis and holding back a furious Athena from murdering her half-brother, while the rest of the council watched on in silence. Lastly had been the release of Hercules, and that thoroughly terrified the council, since there had been an unknown and clearly powerful presence there during the breaking of the seal, keeping the god of strength contained on the island between the Straits of Gibraltar. Major and minor gods alike had panicked for days, but the council quelled them soon enough while managing to keep the information from the camps, but now there were whispers of a new enemy coming along with the ominous name, Umbra, that Talia had called on her disappearance. I wonder what the meeting about now is though. It's been quiet again for a year or two, she wondered as she glanced around and noted that she was in the market of Olympus, still on her way to the throne room. It was depressingly empty compared to usual, with only a few minor gods milling around and some salesmen still calling their pitches. However, with her attention elsewhere, she didn't notice until too late as a child ran into her. She stumbled a bit as the child squeaked in surprise while falling on her bum. Hestia took in her dark brown hair and light green eyes, though something about her face seemed almost familiar. "Oh, I'm sorry, here, let me help you," she said kindly as she offered a hand, which the little girl took eagerly. "Thank you, miss," the little girl, which Hestia assumed was a godling considering she felt different from any demigod. "No problem, sweetie, just be careful now," she replied while ruffling the girl's head, making her pout cutely as Hestia giggled. "Okay, bye miss." The girl chirped before she turned and ran down the market before taking an alley and disappearing from sight. Kids," Hestia said with a faint smile before she frowned as she looked at her own hand, noticing for the first time that there was a note in it. "When did, the girl?" she muttered in surprise before looking around but spotted nothing out of the ordinary. She then looked back at the folded note and slowly opened it before reading the sentence as her eyes widened. The note suddenly caught fire and turned to ash before she could stop it. "What?" she stuttered as she watched the ash blow away, the words written playing over in her head again and again. "Remember my promise, and play along." There was only one person who'd made her a promise she cared about nowadays, and that was Percy. Percy, is he back? Did he return, for me? She asked herself as a spark of hope ignited within her eyes. Percy, the boy who grew into a man, the man that turned into a hero, the hero that claimed her heart. He was coming back and had told only her about it. She suddenly felt giddy as she quickened her pace to the throne room. The note said to play along, so she assumed it meant go about the day as usual. So she did just that as she arrived at her throne soon enough and waited patiently as the others either walked in or flashed in. Once everyone was assembled, Zeus called the meeting to order by sending a bolt into the sky. It had gotten so old no one bothered to even roll their eyes. "This meeting is now in order," he boomed as he looked around the throne room. "Now then, Artemis, anything to report?" he asked testily while rubbing the corner of his lips where Hestia could make out the slightest trace of lipstick, and judging by Hera's fuming expression another child of Zeus was on the way. "Nothing, father," Artemis replied coldly, her eyes never leaving the floor before her. Zeus scoffed before continuing, "And Lupa. At least her pack should be able to get some results." Artemis didn't react to the jab, just merely shook her head in the negative as Zeus grumbled before looking to Poseidon. "And you, brother, any news from the seas? There was that odd earthquake a year or so back that you claim wasn't your doing. Damn near leveled part of the Bay Area in California," Athena added with a snicker at her petty rival. "It wasn't my doing," Poseidon bit back at the wisdom goddess before looking away. Silence reigned for a few moments before Zeus cleared his throat to get the attention before continuing. "Very well. Does any other god have anything else to say or report before we move on to the reviews of our domains and any disturbances?" After a few seconds, Aphrodite slowly raised her hand while wiping away at a tear or two. "Yes, Aphrodite," Zeus asked with a raised eyebrow since Aphrodite never takes an active part of the meetings. "There is something wrong, my lord," Aphrodite answered weakly, much to the growing curiosity of the council. "It seems that, I can no longer have children." She was met with many blank or outright confused faces before Artemis spoke up for the first time, "And who cares about your spawns? All they cause is havoc anyways." Aphrodite got some fire in her eyes as she glared at the huntress. It matters because it means someone powerful cursed me and I can feel the control of my domain reducing by the day. But who could? Hera asked this time as she leaned forward in interest. There are no other gods that share your domain aside from some of your children, and most of them revolve around lust and sex aside from Cupid, but he's your lapdog so he wouldn't try to take control from you. I know that, Aphrodite retorted before looking at her own belly sadly. But then who? And more importantly, why? Maybe it's just a dry spell, Apollo offered as he looked at her before gaining a mischievous smirk. You could stop by for a checkup and see if everything is working as it should, he finished suggestively only to get Aphrodite to blow up at him. I want nothing to do with you, bastard, Aphrodite hissed venomously, making several gods start in surprise. I've already lost my daughter because of you. Me? Apollo asked incredulously before adopting a fake hurt expression. I'm sorry, did I doll her up and take her to a club? Was I the one crying wolf about, poor me and my marriage, before convincing her daughter to cheat? Then Grace should have manned up. Aphrodite snapped angrily. It was supposed to be simple, but you had to tail us and listen in, and what's worse, you intentionally got her caught. So that's what you're worried about? Hephaestus asked with a raised eyebrow, speaking up for the first time in years, especially after he looked for Hestia's counsel on his inaction and later guilt in regards to Percy. Hestia gave him a scathing remark on how cowards shouldn't speak, and he's mostly remained silent ever since. Not that she cheated, but that she was caught and rightfully took out that anger on you. Aphrodite looked at him in surprise but answered nonetheless. Don't try to take the high ground, oh dear husband. You can't come to me with words of shame and fidelity, considering you have demigods too. And besides, in a perfect world Piper would have seen that she didn't need Jason and found herself someone to satisfy her. But because it was you, she said while turning a glare to the sun god. She thinks I set it up for her to get caught and she disowned me. Aphrodite said while screaming at the end with tears falling down her cheeks. TCH, go ahead, blame it on me, Apollo retorted before muttering not too silently. Still gave her the best night of her life. How dare you? Athena hissed as she stood up while radiating a gray aura, having gotten fed up with her half-brother. Have you no shame, you bastard? Isn't my daughter enough? But she's always busy working, Apollo whined back before muttering under his breath. And she's keeping me on the couch anyways. Enough. Zeus boomed before the argument could escalate while lightning cracked along the skies above them. DA, Chapter 44, Hope comes home too. But she's always busy working, Apollo whined back before muttering under his breath. And she's keeping me on the couch anyways. Enough. Zeus boomed before the argument could escalate while lightning cracked along the skies above them. As the gods settled while grumbling, Hestia caught a light chuckle, barely a whisper with a familiar aura, coming from directly behind her head. Don't move, a voice that she'd recognize anywhere whispered before she could in fact turn to look. Trust me, Tia, play along. What are you going to do? She mumbled under her breath while glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention to her, the perks of having always been ignored. Whisking you away on a black wolf and riding away into the midnight, he whispered into her ear so closely that she could feel his breath making her shudder in a very pleasant way. Her eyes peeked to the side but they only caught the slightest wisps of shadow, making her slightly frown in confusion before she glanced around the room. Only now did she notice that all the dark corners and shadows seemed thicker and the general atmosphere was darker, but it seemed most of the Olympians were too caught up in some new argument that Hestia missed the beginning to. She watched as some accusations about interference in a recent war game for Camp Jupiter as the shadows continued to darken. She glanced to Hades and noted that he was looking at the shadows as well but didn't seem bothered at all. Hades, does he know something? She wondered before a dark and near sinister laugh echoed around the room, silencing the squabbling gods. Then, the shadows seemed to flow like little streams together to the center of the room. They coiled and writhed together until they formed a translucent figure of a faceless man with glowing, icy blue dots for eyes. The Olympians stared in silence at the shade as it looked back in turn, the laugh still echoing around them. After a while the creepy laugh died down as the shade gave a mock salute to the council before unceremoniously flipping them all the bird. That got the first reactions since its appearance as Zeus started to golden with rage. Who are you? What is your business here? Zeus roared while his master bolt crackled in his hands. Why hello, the shade replied in a carefree tone in the same voice as the laugh that came from the entire throne room rather than one point. As for why I'm here, well, you'll see soon enough, it replied ominously. You dare threaten us? Zeus boomed as he stood up with his master bolt itching for a throw. But did I state a threat? The shade asked while tilting its head. I did no such thing. Then what do you want? Athena asked as she analyzed the shade intently. Me. It asked while pointing at itself. Nothing, I'm just a reflection of you. What? Hera asked this time as she narrowed her eyes at the shade. Yes, it hissed as it looked around. The demons within your souls, they are so clear. Your doubts, fears, regrets, they sing to the darkness and so I come to them. The shade drifted in midair as it approached Hera, making the goddess in question to narrow her eyes more while discreetly leaning back and away from the shade. The shade hummed while stroking a non-existent beard. Now I see why everyone calls you a heartless bitch. What? Hera gasped in shock while some jaws dropped at the audacity of the shade. How does it feel? The shade asked nonchalantly. Knowing that your bastard of a husband constantly picks mere mortals over you. That his every promise of fidelity is a lie and that you are the laughing stock of every married woman that even knows a remote bit of your past for even believing him. That he forced you to marry only to fill this farce of a council with his bastards. Hera looked like she was in total shock as she looked at the shade, her normally alabaster skin looking as pale and thin as dried out paper. What a pitiful goddess, the shade sighed as it floated away without a second glance at the frozen goddess. It floated uninterrupted until it stopped right in front of Dionysus, the pudgy god having stirred from his usual slumber to glare at the shadowy construct with scorn. Ah, the hypocrite, the shade said while opening its arms in a grand gesture. Hates demigods, calls them arrogant and prideful, that they lie and only harm others. Who was once a demigod again? It asked with a tilted head. Got godhood for some sorry reason and not even a good one. Whine. More like god of whining and all the while takes his little princess, the sweet Diophone, whispers sweet nothings and gets her hand in marriage, only to be as unfaithful as his father and now is stuck with the brats he hates. The shade leaned closer, completely ignoring the golden tone of the god's skin as rage grew within the purple eyes behind the shades. You hate them because they are a reminder of your own failure, your own pathetic existence. By now Dionysus was literally shaking with rage but still made no move to attack, making Hestia wonder what exactly was he waiting for. By all means the shade had said enough to warrant violence from the volatile gods, maybe they each were too curious to see what the shade did or were waiting for a signal to attack. All the while the shade moved on, stopping at Ares and looking him up and down. The god in question puffed out his chest while leveling an aura of hostility but the shade remained impassive. Then, with a dismissive sniff it moved on much to the shock and rage of the war god that watched on, too stunned to try to attack. The shade then stopped before Athena. The goddess looked back with a poker face, staring at the shade before it seemed to chuckle but sounded more like a raspy breath than anything. Unimpressive, it drawled while looking at her and Hestia saw the first bits of Athena normal poker face crack. I prefer you as Minerva. It's a much more accurate representation. Athena's eyes started to get stormy at the statement. Even with the Parthenos returned, she still had a deep-seated hate for the Romans even if she hid it for the sake of civility whenever having to interact with them in the recent years. I wonder, the shade said as it floated around while turning upside down and still within Athena's line of sight. Are you as easy as your daughter? That got a very visible reaction as Athena shot up to her feet with an angry aura around her but the shade gave no pause. Are you sure she wasn't really the slut's daughter instead? I mean, she got tied up with the manwhore and I bet ya she's ridding some minor god or even demigod right now while hubby is here. It continued as Apollo also shot to his feet with a golden aura forming around him while flashing in warning but Hestia could tell by his glazed eyes that he was also using his senses as a god to find Annabeth. Don't you dare speak about my daughter, Athena said through grit teeth. I wonder if you'll ever break your vow only to become unfaithful too. I mean, it probably runs in the family at this point and you're the only one left given the little moon's unmasking. Technically, it continued before ducking down as Athena's fist swung at it but missed. Seemingly finished with Athena the shade moved on until it stopped before Artemis and looked at the goddess with what Hestia could only call hate, even with the expressions limited to the icy blue eyes and shifting of the eyebrows. Ah yes, the hunter, it spat venomously. The shade suddenly shifted around until it looked like the hunter Artemis lost, Phoebe, making the goddess breath hitch as she looked at it with trembling eyes. It was a near-perfect replica, only composed of shadow and the icy blue eyes. Why Artemis, it said in her voice. You abandoned me. No. Artemis shouted as she shot up while looking like she was getting ready to cry. I called and prayed, the shade of Phoebe continued on in an empty voice. But you never came, it hurts, it said as suddenly a chunk of the shade's leg disappeared as if bitten away. You left me, the shade continued to fall apart as if assaulted, bits and pieces ripping off into the darkness until only the head remained unscratched while it stared at Artemis. I guess I was wrong to love you. D.A. Chapter 45. Hope Comes Home 3. You left me, the shade continued to fall apart as if assaulted, bits and pieces ripping off into the darkness until only the head remained unscratched while it stared at Artemis. I guess I was wrong to love you. Artemis' knees started to shake with tears welling up in her eyes before another shade appeared, this time looking like the murdered Paul Bloffus. It looked at Artemis as well before a dagger of shadows formed in its hand. The shade raised it above the head of Shade Phoebe while it said, "Heartless murderer." The knife descended as Artemis screamed while simultaneously summoning her bow and launching an arrow at the shade, but it passed harmlessly through it. The knife was plunged into the skull of the shade Phoebe, making it dissolve into shadow before the shade Paul shifted again, this time facing Poseidon, completely dismissing the hyperventilating goddess holding a shaky bow. The shade then appeared as Sally as Poseidon paled while staring at it. I loved you, it said in her voice. I protected our son when you left us, it accused as Poseidon shook his head without looking away. I raised him with love and devotion, and you used him. Now he's gone because you failed him. No, Poseidon murmured as he started to sweat while looking at the shade. I found a better man and love, Shade Sally continued as Poseidon paled even more. Sally, please, Poseidon started to beg but remained unheard. Faithful, considerate, loving, the shade continued as it slowly stepped towards the trembling sea god. He was a better man, a better husband, a better lover, and a better father than you ever were. Poseidon started to have tears trail down his cheeks as he looked at the shade, but then another knife of shadows appeared and stabbed Shade Sally in the back as a harrowing scream echoed around the throne room before whispering. And you were jealous of a mere mortal, now the guilt and shame will stay until the end of your days. By now Poseidon sat as a broken man, his eyes empty as he stared at the shade. With the sea god finished, it moved to stand before Zeus and hissing, and the filth to lead them all. It quickly shifted between all sorts of people from across the ages as the voice boomed around them, rapist, murderer, liar, cheater, dictator. The shade then split into three people, Talia, Jason, and Hercules. All three spoke in the same voice. Child of Kronos, destined to be betrayed by his own children like his father before him. In the end he shall stand alone, abandoned and lost. You were never the man we called father. Zeus practically glowed with his rage as he roared while shooting a massive bolt at the shade. There was a blinding light and deafening explosion as the throne room shook. Hestia coughed for a moment before she waved her hand to clear the smoke to see a crater where the shade once stood, making her start to worry for Percy. However, the laugh returned as the Olympians looked around wildly. Fool of a king, you can't destroy your own demons with force alone, the voice said as the shade formed again beside the crater. Then, in a deeper and more sinister voice it spoke as power flooded the room. Only through blood and sacrifice can one find redemption, but you are beyond even that. The void beckons Olympians, and the first must fall. Before anyone could say anything, Hestia felt the shadows around her condense into tendrils before grabbing onto her. She started in alarm before she remembered Percy's words and calmed down, but not too calm. He said to play along, so she did, and the key was selling it. She started to thrash without using any godly power to try and destroy the bonds as they dragged her off her throne to the center of the room. Hestia. Several of the Olympians shouted in alarm but didn't move as a dagger of darkness suddenly appeared below her throat. It is only fair, the voice said as the shadows lifted her into a sitting up position as they condensed above her. She glanced up to see an enormous shade wolf form, towering above the Olympians even in their godly heights. The purest is sacrificed for the sins of the wretches, so says the demon, so says Umbra. At the name several Olympians shot up, Artemis in particular flashing dangerously as she prepared to go into her godly form. It won't matter, goddess, the wolf said as it looked directly at her. You have and will continue to fail. Before anyone else could say anything, the shade wolf released a massive roar laced with power, the same power that released Hercules with a blast of cold wind, sending most of the gods stumbling back onto their thrones. In their daze the wolf looked down at her before she felt a presence brush aside her mental defenses and heard Percy saying, "Get ready." With that the wolf lounged in her and bit into her shoulder as it dragged her into the shadows of the floor. Well, damn if she wasn't the sibling of the ultimate drama queen for nothing. No. She screamed as fake tears welled up in her eyes. She locked eyes with her two younger brothers before crying at them, "Save me please." They shouted her name in reply and dived at her but fell short as the shadows consumed her. Hestia felt her entire world shift around wildly for all of 3 seconds before it settled as two strong arms held onto her. She blushed at the contact as she opened her eyes and looked over her shoulder to see that it was in fact Percy, and he looked different. She stared into his flaming black eyes, feeling as if she was being drawn into them until Percy spoke. "Ah, hey," he said sheepishly as he grinned at her. It was with the feeling of his breath passing over her face that she realized she'd been leaning closer to him. She almost gasped as her face went golden while she took a step back and glanced around. They were in a large room made of black marble with a ceiling mirroring the night sky. She then heard some chuckling behind her and turned around to a surprising sight. There seated before her were the lost heroes, several titans, minor gods, and even some primordial gods, all looking at a floating sphere currently showing the throne room on Olympus going insane. "Ah, Percy, you're back," Nyx said cheerily as she got up from and walked towards them while Hestia gaped like a fish at the primordial. "Hello Hestia, welcome to my humble home," she greeted with a warm smile while the others noticed their arrivals as well. Lady Nyx," Hestia stuttered as she gave a hasty curtsy, but Nyx waved it off. Now, you are a guest, so no need for formalities," she said before glancing at Percy. "Wonderful performance by the way. Manipulating shadows into a fake body to taunt them, very creative. How did you get your voice to change though?" "Hecate taught me a few tricks," Percy replied with a proud smile before it turned into a frown. "I would have done worse, but I really didn't want to stick around longer than necessary and risk actually attacking them yet." "Understandable," Nyx agreed before she turned to face Hestia. "And how are you Hestia? I hope the trip wasn't too bumpy." "No, it was very quick," she said with some nervousness, not wanting to possibly offend the primordial. It seemed that Nyx noticed as she raised an eyebrow before speaking. "Relax little one, I'm not going to eat you or anything. You are precious to many here and are more than welcome to make yourself comfortable, well, as comfortable as you can get in Tartarus." "I take offense to that," an enormous man hidden in a black cloak said as he joined them with his glowing red eyes looking down at them, his sheer power and presence alone tipping her off to who he is. Tartarus," Hestia squeaked as her knees started to shake, but then she felt a comforting hand being placed on her shoulder. "It's okay Hestia," Percy said in a soft tone, making Hestia relax instantly. He then pointed to their side and she followed his finger to gasp in surprise. There stood her mother, Rhea, after millennia of being separated. Her mother looked slightly different as well, but at the moment Hestia didn't care as tears built up in her eyes. "Mom," she said softly as her mother nodded before opening her arms in an invitation. Hestia sniffed a bit before she ran forward and embraced her mother, feeling her arms wrap around her for the second time in all her life. The only other time had been when she'd been born just before her father had swallowed her. After the war, Rhea had been banished with the other titans before Hestia could try to form any sort of mother-daughter relationship with her. Only Hestia's prayers had been able to get to where her mother had been hidden and imprisoned by Zeus, but now maybe she had a chance of creating that relationship. She certainly needed it and the guidance since she had no idea how to go about telling Percy about her feelings. Their hug lasted for several minutes, and in that time Hestia felt several presences approach around her. Once she released her hold on her mother, she looked around to many smiling faces that made her smile in return. "Hello Lady Hestia, it's been a while," Talia greeted first, followed by her brother. "It's a pleasure to finally have you here with us," he said with a polite bow. "Yeah, Percy and Rhea wouldn't shut it about wanting to bring you to us already," Nico added with a snicker, only for a young woman with odd purple and blue eyes to smack the back of his head. "Don't tease them Nico," she said before she looked at Hestia kindly, "and hi Hestia, I'm Andromeda Jackson." Hestia gasped in surprise as the group chuckled at her before Andromeda continued, "I know, I'm used to that reaction. Long story short, Percy and Rhea are the ones who rescued me and brought me here. Time passes 5 times faster as well, so I aged sooner. And all your eyes?" she asked as she glanced around the group consisting of Percy, Rhea, Jason, Talia, Andy, Nico, while the others in the room watched on from a respectful distance. They looked at each other with her question before they focused on Percy, making him chuckle before he answered. We're all going to become protogonoi." "What?" she shouted in shock, much to their amusement. "Yeah, don't worry, we'll explain more later at dinner," Rhea said offhandedly before taking her hand. "For now you and me have some catching up to do." With that, Hestia was dragged away from the conference room, as she dubbed it, while shooting one last glance at Percy. He saw it and gave her a faint smile with a nod before he returned to speaking with Nyx and Tartarus. After that Hestia followed her mother until they arrived in a beautiful courtyard with grass made of shadows and ice, decorated with all manner of statues, and a huge white oak in the center. Once there Rhea led her to a bench where the pair sat down before Rhea faced her with a beaming smile. So, how have you been? Rhea asked eagerly, to which Hestia smiled before having a mother-daughter talk for the first time. D.A. Chapter 46. Hope Comes Home IV. After that Hestia followed her mother until they arrived in a beautiful courtyard with grass made of shadows and ice, decorated with all manner of statues, and a huge white oak in the center. Once there Rhea led her to a bench where the pair sat down before Rhea faced her with a beaming smile. So, how have you been? Rhea asked eagerly, to which Hestia smiled before having a mother-daughter talk for the first time. So they spoke for several hours, Hestia telling her everything that had happened in the decade of silence and how she'd been handling it. Rhea looked particularly livid with her account of the council meeting leading to Sally and Paul Bloffus murders and Andy's kidnapping. Apparently she'd already had all the details, but hearing it from Hestia herself and how she felt during it had just had more oil to the flame. Rhea then informed her of how she'd stopped considering Hera, Zeus, and Poseidon her children long ago while being on the fence about Demeter. Another surprise had been that Hades had been in cahoots with them for a few months now, and they'd been looking for the best opportunity to take her from Olympus. They didn't want her to suddenly disappear, since it would correctly lead the Olympians to thinking they were being betrayed. It was better that they thought a new enemy had appeared and was slowly kidnapping all their assets and important gods rather than having them try to clean house, as it were. Hestia understood the reasoning, even though she felt a little disappointed that they couldn't have told her sooner. Olympus had stopped housing her family for some time now, and it was only after Poseidon had struck her that she'd truly come to realize it. The hearth had all but died in that decade of loneliness in the throne room, and now Hestia could feel that for the first time since the very day of their triumph over the Titans, the hearth of Olympus had been extinguished. After they talked on that, the conversation settled down into a comfortable silence as the pair looked on at the courtyard around them. It was then that Hestia thought about bringing up the topic of Percy, so she fidgeted for a moment before poking her mom lightly to get her attention. Once she had it, she spoke shyly. Mother, I need advice on something. Yes? Rhea asked with a tilt of the head. How would you go about telling someone you like them? She asked nervously as Ray's eyes widened before she glanced away. Well, it all depends on the person, I guess, she answered after a few seconds. Some people are best to approach directly while others require a more subtle touch. Oh, Hestia murmured as she thought about Percy. Definitely the kind of man that needs direct and blunt, and possibly a sign considering how dense he could be at times, Hestia thought as a faint smile formed on her lips even as she blushed. She wanted to tell him but was extremely nervous about it. What if he thought she was joking? She is a virgin goddess after all, so maybe he wouldn't even think it was possible to be with her. She was already sure of herself being willing to break that oath if it was him, but she wasn't sure if he felt the same about her. It had been a decade on the mortal world and apparently 5 times longer down here, so what if? So who's the lucky man? Rhea asked, breaking Hestia out of her thoughts. Huh, she replied in surprise as she looked at her mother again. Who have you fallen for? Rhea asked again, making Hestia blush shyly. Percy, she whispered, but her mother didn't look surprised at all. In fact, she just nodded in understanding, but something in her eyes worried Hestia. It was brief, but she caught it. A glint of guilt, but it disappeared quickly and Rhea stood up before Hestia could ask about it. Come on, it's time for dinner, Rhea said with a cheery tone that Hestia found suspicious while she was offered a hand. However, Hestia shook it off for now as she accepted the hand and was led back into the House of Night. So, how are you liking it so far? Percy asked her as they walked around in the courtyard again. Hestia sighed contentedly as a reply while the pair simply walked closely to each other. Dinner had been a rather pleasant and entertaining affair in the House of Night. At first Hestia had been a little uneasy with how everyone, and she meant everyone, got together in an absurdly long table to sit and eat together. It had been such a foreign feeling to her, having everyone together like that as they ate, joked, teased, and generally had a wonderful time together, like a real family. She hadn't even really been that surprised when she met more protogonoi and was formally introduced with some she'd known about but never encountered, such as Damocin, Medusa, and Lamia. Those two really surprised her. Hades and Persephone had shown up as well, much to her delight, and then the dinner had progressed as it usually went, with the addition of filling Hestia in on the details of what exactly had been going on in the past decade. Learning that all those great heroes had effectively become immortals beyond anything the Olympians or Titans before them could ever hope to match had been humbling to say the least. That and with Percy's new look she found it even harder to not look at him, especially his eyes which were so similar to her own made her feel warm inside. However, she'd been a little disappointed when her mother and Nyx took the two seats at his sides, but she didn't let it bother her much. At least now we're alone, she thought happily as she glanced at him as he walked beside her. He looked so handsome with those eyes and darker hair that made him feel mysterious and dangerous, and she'd be lying if she said that didn't like what she saw. However, now wasn't the time for those thoughts, so she shook them away, making Percy glance at her curiously. "So Percy," she said softly as she stopped walking and turned to fully face him. "Can I telling you something?" "Of course," he said as he looked down at her. "Why did he have to get so tall?" She mused before continuing. "You know, I missed you after you left." "I missed you too," he replied as he stepped a little closer. "Every day I thought about you. I've been waiting decades just to bring you here, to keep my promise just to you." Hestia's heart jumped with his every word as smile grew on her face. "It was the same for me, and in that time I realized something," she trailed off as she raised a hand to gently cup his cheek. "And that is that, I love you." At her words Percy's eyes widened before they suddenly dimmed with guilt, making Hestia start to worry. A cold dread gripped her heart. It got even colder when Percy brought a hand up to hers and gently pulled it down as he looked into her eyes. "Hestia, I love you too," he said, but before she could smile he continued. "But, I love another as well." At his words she felt as if her heart was breaking as tears started to well up in her eyes. A shaky breath racked her body as she took an uneasy step back and spotted a figure just past Percy's frame. There she saw Rhea standing beside the oak with the same guilt in her eyes as she watched on sadly. "I see," she mumbled as she looked back at Percy with growing sadness. "I was too late, wasn't I?" "No. That's not it," Percy said in sudden panic as he took a step towards her, but she took a step back. "Then what?" she shouted as her sadness turned to anger. She'd been alone, hoping he'd come back, and when it finally happened all it was to keep one promise even though he'd obviously moved on, and with her mother of all people. "Am I just the seconds you wanted in case it didn't work out? You're already obviously happy with her." "Hestia," Percy said softly as he looked at her sadly, the glow of his icy blue eyes dimming. "No," she shouted as more tears spilled down her cheeks. "I won't let anyone lead me on or use me. But I do love you." He shouted in reply, but she didn't want to hear him. She was about to turn around and flash away, but then a pair of arms suddenly wrapped around her. She knew it was him and tried to thrash out of his grip, but he was too strong, so she resorted to something else. In a sudden spark her entire body was shrouded in raging flames, the ground beneath them hissing and steaming even as she continued her struggles. It seemed in vain though as she felt her own body mutiny against her, relaxing in his embrace even as she tried to keep her rage rather than feel heartbreak as her entire body was shrouded in orange flames and slowly turning into Greek fire. "Just leave me alone," she cried, but he brought his lips to her ears and whispered, "I'm never leaving you alone again, Hestia." He then turned her in his arms as her struggles got weaker as she looked at him, seeing that he was crying as well. "Never again," he said before he brought his lips to hers. She wanted to fight it, to push him away and curse him, but another part of her softened in his arms. His kiss carried passion and unmistakable love even as the embrace itself was tender. Her struggles soon became non-existent as his arms moved to pulling her in by her waist while her hands rested against his chest. The flames that had been once raging around her died out, leaving both of them steaming. Slowly Percy pulled away before looking down at her while wiping away the last of her tears with his thumb. "I love you both, Hestia, and I would never hide that from you or try to play with your heart. I just wanted you to know the truth," he said gently. "I've already come to terms with it along with Rhea. Now it's up to you, but know this, I will love you and accept your decision regardless of what it is." He then kissed her one more time before he released her from his arms and stepped back to give her space as she looked at him. She saw Rhea still observing them sadly, but she didn't focus on that right now as she looked back at Percy. Right now she wasn't sure what to do and her emotions were too raw to make any decisions, so she took a breath to steady herself before looking Percy dead in the eyes. "I would like some time to myself," she said, and he nodded immediately in understanding. "Okay, and if you need anything, just call and I'll be right there," he replied as he turned and walked towards Rhea. The pair gave her one last look before they dissolved into shadows, leaving her alone in the courtyard. She stood silent for a few minutes before she walked towards the oak. Once there she rested her back against it before sinking to the floor and pulling her knees to her chest. Her eyes were still blurry with a few tears as she thought about what just happened, and what she was going to do about it. D.A. Chapter 47. Unbreakable Bonds. Andromeda watched sadly as Hestia continued to softly cry while sitting against the white oak in the courtyard, her presence hidden in the shadows of one of the larger statues. Hestia had been like that for several hours after Percy's confession, and Andy could feel her pain and confusion. Right now Hestia needed someone to confide in, someone to help her sort out her feelings, and hopefully, make a decision. So, taking a deep breath, she slowly walked towards the distraught goddess, keeping her face neutral knowing that looking at Hestia with pity wouldn't help at all. After a few minutes she'd walked close enough to look directly down at the goddess, but Hestia made no move to so much as look at her. So instead Andy got beside her and sat down as well while tugging her knees to her chest. As she did so, she felt herself shift in age until she looked to be around 35 rather than the usual 20s most gods prefer. She wasn't really surprised though, guessing Hestia needed more guidance as from a parent or elder than just a friend. So she sat silently and waited for the goddess to address her instead so that it wouldn't feel forced or intrusive. After nearly 15 minutes she saw the goddess turn her head towards her out of the corner of her eye. Andromeda looked back at her, noting the puffy eyes and tear stains making her want to hug the sad goddess, but she refrained as she waited for Hestia to speak. They looked at each other for some time before Hestia broke the silence and asked, "Can I help you with something?" "No," Andy replied slowly before adding, "but I can help you." "Why?" Hestia asked in a voice laced with distrust. "Because I don't want to see you or my brother or Rhea so sad," she answered softly. "They care about you, Hestia. More than you would have thought." Hestia scoffed slightly while looking away. "Sure they did, didn't stop them from forgetting about me for years while they held each other," she added bitterly before sniffling slightly. "Here I was waiting and hoping, but when he finally came I'd missed my chance." "That isn't true," Andromeda said firmly, getting the goddess to look at her. "Ever since I got here, Percy used to tell all about you. The only Olympian goddess he respected and cared about. There wasn't a day he forgot about you, but Nyx said it would have been too soon to take you away from Olympus, so he had to wait. Rhea was the same, especially after Percy confessed his feelings to her, including you." "And how did she take it?" Hestia asked as she wiped away some tears. "Honestly, pretty well, but that was because I told her beforehand. My brother is the best, but he's still clumsy with sensitive talks and I didn't want him to possibly mess up, so I talked to Rhea while he was gone on a mission. Turned out it helped because when Percy told her himself, she'd already had time to think about it. When she learned you were the other woman Percy had fallen in love with, I'm not too sure what happened there, but I know that they settled it out as well," Andromeda answered. "So what then?" Hestia asked as she looked at her again. "Am I just supposed to go along with it? Will he even care about me the same as my mother? Or is he just being greedy?" "That's your anger talking," Andy replied firmly as she looked at the goddess. "And you can trust me when I say his love for you is genuine. I've watched for decades as both Rhea and Percy missed you and wanted to bring you here sooner." "Decades?" Hestia asked with a frown. "Time in Tartarus passes 5 times faster than in the mortal world, remember," Andy explained before continuing. "And in that time their love grew between them, but also for you. I could see it, like a third of them was missing, and whenever they asked Nyx if they could get you, but she said no, both would get sad for a whole day. They care about you, Hestia, and want you to be happy too." I just don't know," Hestia said unsurely as she looked down. "Hestia," Andy said gently as she cupped the goddess' chin and turned her to face herself. "They do love you and didn't want to hurt you in any way." Andromeda then stood up before offering a hand to the goddess. "Come on, walk with me." Hestia looked at her hand for a few hands before taking it slowly and getting pulled up. Once both were up, Andromeda snapped her fingers to make a napkin pop into her hand before using it to wipe away the last of Hestia's tears and cleaning off her cheeks. After that was done, the two started to walk through the courtyard and towards the House of Night as Andromeda spoke. "Tell me, Hestia, what's really holding you back?" Hestia looked at her nervously as she rubbed her own arms while remaining silent. After a minute or so she finally spoke. "I'm scared." "Okay. Of what?" Andy persisted as Hestia looked down. "Of being forgotten," she replied softly. I was too scared to tell Percy how I felt all those years ago, and looked what happened. He fell in love with someone else, someone prettier, more experienced, stronger, and everything better than me." By now Hestia's eyes were getting watery again and crying was bound to come up, but Andromeda pulled her into a hug while rubbing her back. Hestia, you know Percy isn't like that, she said soothingly. Yes, you've never loved like this before and it scares you that you might do something wrong, especially when there is someone else to be compared to but neither would want you to be anything other than yourself. Percy loves you for you Hestia, not because you're the prettiest or strongest or any sort of thing. Andromeda could feel Hestia slowly nodding into her shoulder as she let out a few more tears as Andy tried to reassure her more. Tell me Hestia, do you still feel the same way about him? She asked softly. Hestia remained silent for some time until in a low voice she said, yes. And even knowing that you'd have to share him, does it mean you love him any less? No, Hestia replied while shaking her head softly. Then there you go, Andromeda said in a warm voice. The three of you deserve love Hestia and I know you'll need each other. Percy especially will need you both. You're one of his reasons for fighting, for wanting to create a better and safer future, and for not losing hope drowning in his own vengeance. You were there for him when Kronos attacked, you became his friend during the year of peace you had before Hera's plan, and you were his shoulder to cry on when Annabeth broke his heart. You're precious to him Hestia and no matter what, he will always love you. Andromeda then broke the hug and leaned back to look directly into Hestia's eyes. Rhea too. You're the one who remembered her and used to still pray to her to show her that she simply hadn't been locked away to be forgotten. You are her firstborn and she wants to see you happy. That's why she was more than willing to share Percy with you, because it is you. Anyone else would have been brained if they so much as looked at Percy with less than pure intentions. Trust me, it nearly happened to Lamia one time, she added with a snicker. Hestia giggled slightly as well and there Andromeda knew that her talk had been a success. She smiled at the goddess before pinching her cheek earning an annoyed pout but Andy just giggled at the face. Now go and get your man. She cheered before leaning closer with a suggestive wink. And if anything, show Rhea that just because she has experience doesn't mean she'll always be on top. Hestia practically glowed with a golden blush as Andromeda started to laugh at the sight in good humor before shoving the goddess slightly. Go on now, they should be somewhere in the kitchen since Rhea cooks when she's nervous, or in Percy's room trying to relax while waiting, Andy instructed as she shifted back into her usual 21-year-old form. Hestia gave her a firm nod before walking back in the direction of the House of Night while Andy sighed. First successful matchmaking. She mentally cheered before wondering what else to do for the day. So far there wasn't much more than training every day until Tartarus and Nyx decided they were ready for the big moves and becoming full protogonoi. She then glanced at a white gold ring given to her by Hemera to transport to the Palace of the Sky whenever she wants. Oh well, let's go annoy Hemera, she said with a shrug before focusing on the ring and dissolving into particles of light. Percy watched as Rhea drifted back and forth between the oven and the counter as she fussed over her cooking pastries, her fingers twitching nervously at times. It was slightly annoying watching her move back and forth like that but he could understand where she was coming from. He was just as nervous, if not more so than she was while waiting for Hestia. Hestia. Man, he'd made a blunder there and he'd thought he'd grown a little more tactful but again he ended up putting his foot in his mouth. He came off way too blunt and sudden and nearly made Hestia run off. Seeing her look so heartbroken and crying had felt like he stabbed himself through the heart with a Stygian iron blade. He never wanted to see her crying unless they were tears of joy. Then, the very thought of losing her made him jump into action, kissing her with everything he could to try and show her that he loved her just as much as Rhea. Even if she'd tried to resist at first, with the fire burning around them, luckily he still had her blessings making him fireproof, he could literally feel her emotions in the fire. There was anger yes, but more than anything it was sadness and a feeling of loneliness within it that Percy tried his damnedest to try and soothe. Then with that kiss, their first and likely her first entirely, he'd felt her return his need for her equally. In that moment he had no doubt that both Rhea and Hestia were the women for him, that without them he was incomplete. Now all he could do was pray to Lady Chaos and hope that Hestia accepted it. With those thoughts he remained silent as he continued to observe Rhea as she took out a batch of blue cookies before throwing in another tray full, her foot tapping nervously as she got ready to prepare yet another batch. Seeing that his girlfriend was spinning herself into a frenzy he got up from his stool and walked to her before wrapping his arms around her waist making her squeak in surprise. Love, calm down, he said softly as she turned in his arms to face him with worried eyes. But, I know, you're nervous and so am I, he said as he rubbed her back. But please, I need you to try and relax. We've done everything we can and now it is up to her. And if she decides she doesn't want to be with you because of me? Rhea asked as her eyes started to get watery. You can't blame yourself for that, Rhea, he said sternly as he cupped her chin to make sure she looked straight up at him. I made my choice knowing the risks and I will never regret being with you. Yes, it would hurt if she said no, but I would survive and so would you. Rhea stared at him silently for a few minutes while sniffing occasionally before she hugged him closer and buried her face in the crook of his neck. He rested his chin on her head as he tried to comfort her more, knowing that even if he said it, Rhea would still blame herself if Hestia rejected them. He sighed at the thought and felt a pang of pain in his chest, but it wouldn't be the first time he felt such pains, as sad as that is. She loves you, Rhea suddenly said without moving her head, making her warm breath wash over his throat. And as any mother, I want to see her happy, but was I being selfish this time around? Percy thought about it for a moment before softly replying, yes. Rhea pulled her head back as she looked at him in slight surprise, but he continued on, and there is nothing wrong with that. After what you've been through and waited, I think you were entitled to happiness. And, even when you got it, you still considered how Hestia would feel about it and allowed me to try and also have a relationship with her. So please, don't blame yourself if this turns out different from what we wanted, okay? Rhea stared at him intently for a few minutes before she gave him a faint smile as she nodded. Okay, I love you. And I you, he said before leaning down slightly to give her a tender kiss. At the embrace she brought her arms up and wrapped them around his neck as he tugged her by her waist, finding comfort in the warmth of her body being pressed up against his. They stayed like that for several minutes before they caught someone clearing their throat, making both snap their heads in the direction of the noise. They were treated to the sight of a slightly blushing Hestia, the Olympian looking away slightly as her hands nervously played with the golden rope tied around her waist. Rhea and Percy looked at her awkwardly for a moment before they released each other and turned to face her, both suddenly getting tense as they waited for Hestia to give them her answer. They all remained silent for some time until Hestia fought her nerves down enough to look at them properly. So, she started while looking them up and down. I've decided. D.A. Chapter 48. Unbreakable Bonds 2. They all remained silent for some time until Hestia fought her nerves down enough to look at them properly. So, she started while looking them up and down. I've decided. Percy caught Ray's breath hitch as he just went still, hoping to hear good news, or at least a gentle rejection. After a minute, Hestia gave them a nervous but warm smile as she walked up to them. Once close enough, she enveloped both in a hug which they soon returned while sharing a glance. Yes, Hestia said gently, making both pull back so they could look at her face properly. So you, he trailed off as a familiar warmth filled his chest, to which she gave a bigger smile. Yes, she repeated, making both of them beam at her and pull her into a tight three-way hug. It lasted for a bit before Hestia pulled back slightly to look Percy directly in the eyes. As long as you treat us equally and fairly, I will agree to it, she trailed off for a moment as she glanced at Rhea before continuing. I can tell Rhea loves you just as much as I do, and how could I even look at myself in a mirror if I tried to make you choose? Hestia then shook her head with a wistful smile. No, in the end there isn't a valid reason to not try, and I love you regardless of whether I'm the only one or not. By now Ray's eyes were a little watery as she pulled Hestia into a fierce hug, all the while mumbling, thank you, again and again. Hestia gave her an understanding smile as she returned the embrace, both finding comfort and reassured in each other as Percy watched on contently. After well over a minute the duo separated slightly as Hestia looked to Percy again and asked in a shy voice, so that means I'm your girlfriend too? Percy didn't need to answer that with words. Rather, he gave a mischievous grin and leaned forward to steal a quick kiss before Hestia could react. How's that for an answer? He asked with a wolfish smirk and slight growl, getting a nice little golden color out of Hestia's cheeks. Down boy, Rhea said in a teasing voice as she eyed him in a not-so-innocent way. Or are you in need of more training? She added in a purring tone. Hestia looked between them for a moment with a slight glint of confusion before suddenly blushing as she looked at Rhea in slight surprise. Already? She asked in a shy whisper, making Rhea raise an eyebrow. She got the meaning of the question at the same time as Percy, both giving sheepish smiles, to which Hestia pouted before mumbling, I was hoping to be his first. Too bad Percy and Rhea has excellent hearing. Hestia. Rhea started in a scandalized voice before giving a sly grin while leaning closer. How naughty. Barely in a relationship and already having such provocative thoughts, Rhea then leaned even closer to continue whispering something into Hestia's ear, all the while Percy was stuck in a daze. Hestia's comment following so close after Ray's had left him with a very vivid picture, completely centered on making two goddesses scream his name. He snapped himself out of it though when he caught a squeak come from Hestia, the goddess blushing so hard that Percy wondered if she might pass out while Rhea had a cat caught the canary smile, reveling in the effects of her teasing. It seemed she was going to push for more but Hestia noticed her leaning closer. Hestia responded by burying her face in Percy's chest as he chuckled while Rhea giggled at the rather adorable display. Oh chaos, I love these girls, he thought fondly as he hugged Hestia to him for a moment before using one hand to tip her head up. He smiled down at her before leaning closer and giving her a gentle kiss. She was hesitant at first but after a few seconds she warmed up to it and started to push her lips back as he kept her close to him. In that moment everything felt right to him. Her unmistakable warmth, her fiery scent, the sweet taste of her lips as her small body fit like a puzzle piece against his. He relished in it before he nibbled at her lower lip eliciting a tiny moan which drove him wild. He was about to pass his tongue over her lips to ask for entry but to his dismay she pulled back a little, their lips still connected by a string of saliva. He loved the look of her eyes glazed with happiness, her face flushed golden as she breathed heavily. It took all his willpower to not kiss her again just to steal her breath away but for now he controlled it as he glanced at Rhea. The former titaness was smirking at the sight even with the faintest golden dusting on her cheeks letting Percy know that Rhea had appreciated the sight. He gave her a wolfish grin as he moved Hestia to his right side before opening his left or inviting Rhea closer. She smiled as she obliged and stepped up to him so that his left arm could wrap around her waist and keep her close. He looked down at her for a moment before kissing her just as softly as he had Hestia even though a part of him wanted to deepen the kiss. She gave him playful nibbles as his arm around her tightened and he occasionally nibbled back on her lips to get small whimpers from her. He kept doing so for a while before he felt Hestia stir again in his right arm making him finally break the passionate kiss with Rhea. He straightened up more so that he could look at both goddesses, loving the blush on both as they looked at him with love and traces of lust in Rhea's case while Hestia seemed a little too innocent for that at the moment. So, he started as he looked between them. I'm the luckiest man around with two incredible girlfriends. And don't let it go to your head, Rhea said in a teasing tone while glancing at Hestia and winking. It'll be our job to keep this one in line. Hestia giggled at that while both ignored his indignant, hey. Of course it only served to make both giggle at him but he could only smile at the sight. I love you both, he suddenly said as he tugged them closer before giving each a small kiss. And we love you, Hestia replied this time before snuggling against his chest. Rhea hummed while doing the same. They remained together like that for several minutes before Percy realized how late it was, and they currently had over 3 dozen cookies either made or on the way. So, he started getting both girlfriends to look at him. Anyone feeling like cookies before bed? He asked with a grin. The goddesses shared a glance before smiling and nodding as Rhea escaped his arms to check on the latest batch in the oven while Hestia went towards the already cooled tray from earlier. Percy just stood there and marveled at the sight of his gorgeous girlfriends for a few minutes before he gave a content sigh and joined them. Andromeda Pav. Andromeda felt her body become solid again as she blinked away the white haziness that she always got whenever she used the light travel. After a few seconds she was in the clear so she looked around the familiar sight of the Palace of the Sky. The palace reminded her slightly of the Taj Mahal but with a more European style, with battlements and a central observation tower going through the center of the palace. She looked around to see she'd arrived at a form of teleportation pad for Uranus realm. He'd made it so that only he could freely teleport in and out of the palace from any location, all other visitors need to enter from the pad. Sure, once in the realm they could move around freely via teleportation but they could only leave at the pad as well. The pad was made of white marble, big enough for about 8 adults to stand next to each other comfortably, and then further surrounded by pond of crystal clear water. Funny thing is that unless you notice the ripples, you wouldn't realize there was water and the pad would look like it was simply suspended over nothing with one walkway leading to the palace beyond. She remembered the first time she came here, nearly having a heart attack at the sight below her. From what her brother told her, you could see most of New York City from Olympus when the clouds part but in the Palace of the Skies, it was completely different. They were so high up they could see the entire North American continent without issue and as it turned out, without having a blessing from Hemera, Ether, or Uranus, or at least a minor permission, a mortal wouldn't be able to breathe in this realm as opposed to the poison of Tartarus. There was oxygen and other small molecules but not nearly enough for even the highest flying birds, though thanks to being demi-primordial or near-primordial, Andromeda along with the others already mostly breathed the particle ether, named after the said primordial and as the particle godly being's breath. Ether, being one of the mythic particles since human science still isn't even close enough to recognize the particles or several hundred others around the universe. That aside, the sight was breathtaking, and when looking up, Andromeda could even see the distant sun and moon. Not the chariots of the twins, seeing as their rides were more like godly tethers to the actual celestial bodies and were part of the influence to make the world and moon rotate. Long ago, between Nyx and Hemera, they had handled the rotations of night and day just with their thoughts before the Titans came along with the beginning of the lunar cycle thanks to Selene. I wonder if Percy and Jason will keep the lunar cycles after offing Artemis. Then again, Hecate could take over since she has the moon as part of her domains too, Andy mused as she started to walk towards the palace. As she watched the surrounding gardens of the palace, formed on shifting gray and white tiled pathways. In fact, it almost made the palace look like one enormous spider with the legs spread out to form different buildings and constructs. Above it, small versions of the constellations could be seen, making her smile slightly. It took her a few minutes to finally arrive in a grand courtyard before the palace, but instead of going into the immense building, she turned and headed towards another walkway holding the arena. She could already feel the power of several protogonoi. The area had a large roadway formed out of the white marble and rows of solid light posts along the sides, leading to a towering area 3 times larger than the Colosseum. As she walked, Andromeda received polite waves and nods from sky spirits and the manifestations of the constellations, which she replied to in kind. The spirits here were very friendly and respectful, though some of the more well-known spirits like the Zodiac tended to be annoying at times. She was still polite to them though, and soon enough she entered a large archway leading into the arena. D.A. Chapter 49, Unbreakable Bonds 3. As she walked, Andromeda received polite waves and nods from sky spirits and the manifestations of the constellations, which she replied to in kind. The spirits here were very friendly and respectful, though some of the more well-known spirits like the Zodiac tended to be annoying at times. She was still polite to them though, and soon enough she entered a large archway leading into the arena. Andromeda Pav. It took a few minutes, but soon she was rows upon rows of lined seats with a prime view of the currently in use arena. She arrived just as a brutal shockwave of air blasted over her, making her hair whip around wildly as she squinted slightly. There in the arena were Jason, dressed in his usual light coat, white shirt, and gray jeans with Revelation held in a two-handed grip as a heavy sweat trailed down his brow. Next to him was Talia, dressed in a white sports bra and matching white tights reaching her shins, a gray jacket, and her long black hair with gray streaks pulled into a ponytail. In her hands though were 2 knives made of crackling blue lightning, while her feet had her manifestation of power from claiming her primordial seat. While Percy and Jason had their coats, Andy had her glove, and Rhea had emerald gauntlets reaching up to her biceps, Talia had boots reaching up to her knees formed of what would be best called hyper-condensed wind and lightning stitching. The cover along her shins and top of her foot was made of oddly blue-tinted wind, while the sole of her foot and calf had lightning formed into a nearly second skin. With her boots she could literally slice through just about anything with a kick that wasn't a primordial symbol of power or manifestation of power. Andy would know. She watched Talia decapitate a Drakon with a kick, the wind shred through the tough scales like wet mud with unnerving ease. Talia could run damn fast too. Across from them were Ether and Orinus, each dressed in sparring clothes modeled after tradition Greek armor with solid light braces and shin guards. Andy also spotted a few destroyed shields, some looking like they were sliced through with seared edges. That would have been Jason's sword. Damn thing is basically a lightsaber, Andy mused as she continued to watch. Jason and Talia shared a look before nodding, then both dashed off in near blurs of white and blue as they closed the distance. Talia took the direct route against Ether, swiping both electric knives at the primordial, but he managed to dodge, only for Talia to pivot on her right foot and bring a vicious backkick with her left. Ether was too close to dodge, so instead he brought up his solid light spear to block. The impact sounded like a cannon going off as a blast of lightning and light flared along with another pressure shockwave, yet neither combatants gave ground. While they were locked, Andy turned her attention to Jason as he literally became a ray of light running circles around Orinus looking for any opening, but the elder primordial was not one to let slip. Finding none, Jason suddenly rushed closer while jumping, taking a more solid form as he brought Revelation down, only for Orinus to raise his own long sword made of lightning like Talia's knives. The flash from the collision this time was near blinding, forcing Andy to squint as massive fractures formed beneath Orinus. Once she got a better sight, she could see that Orinus was in a deadlock with Jason, the meeting point of their blades sparking angrily as they tried to push each other. It lasted for a minute before both disengaged, only to watch each other for a moment. Soon Talia joined Jason's side as Ether landed beside Uranus, his spear at the ready. Only a second passed before the combatants surged at each other again. Andromeda continued to observe for a few more minutes before she felt a familiar presence arrive beside her. She turned to look at the spirit and as usual found her incredibly pretty with molten eyes, coppery skin and dark, glossy hair fitting of a Persian princess. She was dressed in a simple white gown reaching her knees with a cream rope tied at her waist and Greek sandals. Zoe, Andromeda greeted the former huntress. Andromeda, Zoe replied with a polite nod before her gaze went back to the fighters. They both watched silently for a few minutes before Zoe spoke up again. It's still hard to believe at times. This impending war, Zoe clarified even as neither stopped looking at the battle. To think that the Olympians would finally go so far as to betray their greatest heroes and lead to their own demise. But is it truly that hard to believe? Annie asked as she finally looked back at the former Titan. After all, you were there and know how unfair or cruel the Olympians can be. Zoe frowned but didn't object to it. Instead she sighed before looking at Andromeda. I can understand, it just feels like so long ago. Dying really warped my sense of time and with some of what I've seen, it's made to question everything I believed. Zoe turned away to look at the fight again. I remember when Lord Uranus asked me to watch the Olympian Council on the day they decided to take Percy's family. I truly cried for the first time since I came here and for months I awoke every day hoping it was a bad dream, but it never was. Even when I accepted seeing such a cruel side to my former mistress, I still tried to deny it inside. And what now? Are you still denying it and wish to try to convince us to change away from war? Andy asked with a quirked eyebrow but Zoe shook her head. After what they did to you I could never stomach the thought of defending them. If anything, the only thing I would ask is to give Artemis a quick death. You know that isn't possible with Percy, Andy replied with a slight frown. She still didn't like the thought of her brother performing torture but then again, with the mention of Aphrodite her thoughts turned to a similar direction at times since she wanted to make the foul goddess pay for all the pain she's caused. I know, Zoe said softly. Well then at least the few of the huntresses that didn't treat men as cruelly as the rest. I think Percy will spare the younger ones but in the recent years they haven't added any to the ranks so it might be safe to say that all current hunters are marked for death, even if they look like they're 8, Andy answered. Zoe hummed in agreement before commenting, this is very impressive though. What is? Andy asked as she watched Jason manage to kick Ether back only to rush him again in a flurry of slashes and stabs. This level of combat, Zoe answered. The Hesperides weren't always limited to the garden and I did see some of the battles between the first Olympians and the Titans. Sure, they were incredibly powerful but they only reached this range of strength and speed when they assumed their divine forms. To think that you lot could fight like this without being full protogonoi is humbling to say the least. I have no doubts that on the battlefields it will be nothing short of massacres. Well, when you think about it, the Olympians were scared of Gaia, the weakest fighter among the protogonoi, when it was just her and she wasn't fully restored to power even though she'd finally awakened completely. Just imagine what they'll do when they realize they are fighting several, fully awakened trained protogonoi. I dare say they might actually surrender to save their own hides, Zoe chuckled before gaining a dark smirk. Too bad even then they wouldn't be spared. Very true, Andromeda replied sighing as she turned away. Are you going to find Lady Hemera? Zoe asked to which Andy nodded. Yeah, I feel like talking to her for a while before going to sleep would be nice. Mind if I join you? Zoe asked. Sure, Andy chirped before the pair left the arena, the combatants still going strong into the night. With Percy, morning after. Percy gave a slight groan as he started to stir from his sleep. He cursed Nyx mentally for drilling it into his head to always wake up early regardless of how late he might have gone to sleep the night before. That and having a serious sugar rush didn't help him get any extra rest. Curse Rhea and her amazing cookies. Still, he was already awake so no point in complaining now so he opened his eyes while trying to sit up only to find that he couldn't. He glanced down to see 2 brunette heads making him smile, especially being able to feel the warm and soft flesh resting on him. Rhea was to his right, having used his chest as her pillow while tangling her legs with his, her near see-through nightgown teasing his sight of her breasts pressed up against him. Then to his left was Hestia, having taken some convincing to join them in their bed rather than take a guest room since she was a little shy around them but they wore her down. She'd been close but not touching when they went to sleep but in the night she'd snuggled closer to the point of using his shoulder as her pillow while pulling his arm between her sizable breasts. She was also more curled up while wearing a more modest yet still attractive, cream-colored nightgown that just barely reached past her hips. How did I get so lucky? He asked himself before slowly sitting up, much to the protesting whines of his girlfriends. He chuckled at the adorable pouts he was getting as Rhea stirred first while Hestia tried to pull the sheets over her head. However, before anything could be said, Percy felt someone approaching through flash, so he looked away from the sudden blinding light. Once it died down, it revealed Nyx looking both excited and a little sad at the same time. Nyx, Rhea muttered as she sat up fully while rubbing her eye. What is it? Percy also looked at Nyx questioningly as Hestia finally got up too and squeaked in surprise at realizing it was Nyx after throwing off the last dregs of drowsiness. Once all three were looking properly at her, she spoke in a serious voice, "It's time." At that, Percy sat up straighter as he knew what those two words meant. Time? Hestia asked nervously as she noticed how Percy and Rhea reacted to Nyx's words. Yes, Tartarus has already made the preparations needed, Nyx continued as she glanced at Hestia. The last test before Percy, Andromeda, Phoebe, Rhea, Jason, and Talia claim their place as full protogonoi, and the current primordial gods move on to the realm of the fated, she answered, making Hestia gasp. So, Percy started as he looked at Nyx in the eyes. What's the test? Combat, she said before her next sentence shocked all three. You will do something that all 12 Olympians or the group of Kronos most loyal couldn't do, you will face and kill Typhon. D.A. Chapter 50, Typhoon Falls. Hard to believe it's finally time. Percy glanced to Jason beside him as the pair walked across the fields of Tartarus, headed to the arena of the pit and towards their hardest challenge yet. It had been several hours since Nyx came to him with the news of their impending fight, and he was honestly feeling nervous. Typhon, Titan of storms and monsters and the last but strongest child of Gaia Soli. Also mentally incomplete and therefore a completely loyal pawn given to Kronos, even though Typhon easily outclassed any other immortal save for the Protogonoi. It was only thanks to the Council of Protogonoi having been dissolved long before and Typhon never being given a primordial domain that kept him limited to the class of a Titan, but his sheer size gave it away, being on par with the true size of a primordial. Now they were about to face him and they weren't full Protogonoi either. Percy knew this would be the make or break and that none of the primordial gods would step in to save them this time. He couldn't help but open and close his hands in anticipation for this fight, but also concern for his family getting ready to fight. Jason looked nervous as well, but he didn't have any obvious nervous tick like Percy showing. The two near primordial beings looked at each other in a monetary pause, the screams of the truly damned and tortured echoing around them. Are you ready? Percy asked in a calmer voice than he was feeling. Jason gave him a stern look before flashing a faint smile while offering his hand. Percy smiled as they locked hands tightly while nodding. Brothers till the end, Jason said before both let go and faced the arena again. Percy took a breath before saying, "Let's go, no time to waste." With that, the pair started moving faster, arriving to the arena in a few minutes, and they soon stood within the actual battle floor. Percy glanced around to see his family already waiting and each being dressed for full combat as they looked at them. While Nico couldn't yet fight at this level since he still hadn't claimed the right to be an heir, he'd been adamant in helping with the battle even though Percy tried to convince him otherwise. Phoebe and Styx weren't fighting though, considering they weren't going to be on the front lines in this war even if they could fight if necessary. The others stood at the ready with the armor and weapons displayed. Rhea was dressed in a dark green, nearly black chiton that cut off at mid-thigh with slits for movement, a bright green sash around her slim waist, and dark green tights underneath. Next was a black leather jacket reaching down to her thighs as well that Percy made for her out of darkness fibers with a tensile strength of steel for easy movement yet added protection. On her arms over the coat sleeves were her manifestations of power, her emerald gauntlets made of perfectly cut emerald tinted with gold within the precious rock. Her legs were covered by knee-high boots made from the same solid darkness as her coat, only with added emerald shin guards and a slight heel. Her hair was pulled back into a high ponytail with a green ribbon and her hazel gold eyes were focused intensely as she held her bow staff, Testament, at her side. To Percy she looked more like a beautiful goddess of war ready to lay waste to those who dare oppose her. Next to Rhea was Andromeda, dressed her usual red long-sleeve shirt, corset, plaid skirt, thigh-high leather boots with Tartarian steel heels and toes, Tartarian steel bracers with her manifested glove on her left hand and her knives currently in bow form, Absolution, in her hands, and lastly her coat similar to Rhea. Percy could see the apprehension in Andy's purple and blue eyes as she glanced at him, but he sent her a reassuring smile. Beside Andromeda was Talia, Dressed in gray and white chiton given to her by Hemera with solid light bracers and small breastplate, her legs covered in her condensed wind boots while small tendrils of electricity crackled off them. In her hands was her own personally forged bow, Genesis, made of mixed Tartarian steel with solid light and a solid lightning string. Her longer hair was braided and reaching to her lower back as her intense, deep blue eyes with tendrils of gray-blue electricity coursing through them focused like the huntress she still is. Nico stood next to Talia, dressed in a special black bicker jacket decorated with red streaks soaked in the Styx River and padded with Tartarian steel along with his usual skull shirt and leather pants, lastly with Tartarian steel bracers and shin guards while ending in his own leather boots. His own claymore modeled after Tartarus but cooled in the river Styx while being smelted in hellfire was leaner, with a smoother tapper. The blade's name was Damnation and true to its word, being cut by that sword was as painful as burning in hellfire. Percy would know, Tartarus tested it on him to see his pain tolerance before removing the fires and healing the scars himself. Lastly were Percy and Jason themselves looking near identical with their coat of darkness light, matching shirts, black leather or gray pants, and their preferred boots with Percy being darkness leather while Jason still liked the cowboy ones only reinforced with Dracon hide leather. Neither liked wearing armor much though aside from their manifestations of power which were close to near perfect armors themselves. The only drawback is that the manifestations of power are just that, condensed power. Percy's coat, just like everyone else's manifestations, were only indestructible as long as power was supplied, otherwise under constant pressure they would break at some point and leave them exposed though they also self-repaired as the primordial in question recovered as well. Still, with his coat and his blades, Purgatory and Sin, his katana and Viking Wolfbeard respectively, strapped to his hips on opposing sides while Jason had his long sword, Revelation, strapped to his back. They were as ready as they could get to face the monster that had never truly been brought down. Twice Typhon had been bested but only to the point of being unable to fight back, having a mountain hurled on him through the combined efforts of the elder Olympians and later dragged to the underworld thanks to Poseidon and Hades along with the Cyclops army weighing the Titan down. This time though, it would be Typhon's death, no half measures or imprisonment. With one last glance at his assembled team Percy looked to Tartarus and gave him a curt nod. The primordial nodded back before raising his arm and with it, the entire arena started to shake. Their gathered allies hunkered down as the group stared at the far end of the arena. Tartarus had expanded it to fit half of New York City and they could clearly see a massive fissure opening up on the other end. They watched as red hues of flames spewed out along with the clinking of massive celestial bronze chains filled their ears while the ground around them continued to shake. They could feel the power surging out of the growing chasm as the sole occupant stirred from his forced slumber. Then, suddenly the sound of chains moving stopped and as did all the noise, even the pained screams of the damned in the distance. That can't be good, Percy thought before all void broke loose. RAAAAAWWWWRRRRR. A massive bellow blasted across the arena with gale force winds buffeting at them as the ground shook even more but the team stood firm. Then, one massive clawed hand came out of the chasm, being big enough to crush a god even in their divine form, reach out and crashed onto the arena floor with a deafening boom. Soon another hand followed as Typhon hauled himself out of the hole Tartarus had kept him in since the monster was brought down over a decade ago by surface world time. Then, the monstrous head of the Titan, still surrounded in storm clouds even though they could see his face through it as it morphed between innumerable beastly forms, each more horrid than the last with glowing red eye lacking irises or pupils. His foul scent assaulted their noses as he pulled himself further from the chasm, the celestial bronze chains that once held him falling off in clumps with heavy crashes. Soon a shadow overtook them as Typhon's charred and scared body towered over them, his dark brown and green splotched skin looking like boiling tar as the Titan measuring nearly 120 meters, 400 feet stood up fully. Percy wouldn't hide it, he felt intimidated at the sheer presence of the monster and what it could do. He thanked chaos that Typhon never finished fully forming proper mental functions otherwise the Titans and Olympians alike would have been utterly decimated and he would reign above all while his mother slept to her content. Typhon gave another challenging bellow as Percy and his friends readied their weapons as they prepared to fight the closest thing they could get to a primordial. Percy took one glance around before nodding, having already planned the strategies with his team to take the massive Titan down. Percy took a breath as his stance relaxed for but a moment. This was it, the true hurdle before the war. Everything has been leading up to this and he wasn't about to fail now. Go! He shouted as they all surged forward in bursts of speed, weapons poised and ready for the kill. Percy raced beside Jason as the pair locked onto their target, Typhon's chest. The pair ran as blurs before both hunched down and jumped, the ground beneath them cratering as they blasted up light cannonballs towards Typhon. As they ascended, Percy brought Sin forward, the Viking blade's tip sinking into the Titan's flesh and mincing through the thick muscle underneath as Percy's rise slowed. Typhon roared in anger more than anything as it brought a hand up to swat him like a fly, but then Jason, having reached the highest point of his jump, leveling him with Typhon's sternum, brought out Revelation and drove the blade into Typhon's chest, sinking it halfway to the hilt and keeping him hitched to the Titan. D.A. Chapter 51. Typhoon Falls. 2. Typhon roared in anger more than anything as it brought a hand up to swat him like a fly, but then Jason, having reached the highest point of his jump, leveling him with Typhon's sternum, brought out Revelation and drove the blade into Typhon's chest, sinking it halfway to the hilt and keeping him hitched to the Titan. Now Typhon's roar had pain to it, but it wasn't enough, not nearly enough. Their symbols of power may be sharp enough to cut the Titan's flesh with ease, but with their size they couldn't reach into the denser muscles where real damage could be struck. Percy, noting that he'd slowed down too much to get higher, stabbed both Purgatory and Sin into Typhon's ribs to hook himself to the Titan. With his foothold secured, he watched as Typhon tried to bring his massive claw down on Jason, but as the hand came closer, suddenly a bolt of lightning hit it with enough force to make Typhon abruptly twist to the side. Percy glanced down to see that Rhea had leveled the arena floor to create several spires and columns of rock for different vantage points, some going as high as Typhon's thighs. Talia stood on one with her bow, Genesis, trained on Typhon, another arrow of pure lightning already formed and notched. Soon another arrow made of purple energy struck Typhon in the neck, followed by a burst of ichor as the arrow pierced his protective hide, but not deep enough to inflict lasting damage. It had been Andromeda with her knives in bow form, Absolution, her arrows having larger piercing power while Talia being more of a large bomb on impact. Together the pair fired off arrow after arrow, being careful to not hit Percy or Jason as the pair scaled Typhon's body, Jason being closer to the goal than Percy at the moment. Seeing as he was farther than he wanted, he glanced around while watching as Typhon brought his hand down and nearly hit Jason, but the bugger managed to toss himself to the side and drop a good 2 stories before stabbing his sword in again to stop from falling to the floor. Percy noticed that Typhon's hand was pretty close, so thinking quickly he tugged Purgatory out of the Titan's flesh and sheathed it before focusing on his hand. Frost and darkness radiated off his right hand before his void crystal started to form in the design of a hook, and soon it lengthened to form a chain. He then spun it to gain some momentum before he whipped it around, sending the hook at Typhon's retreating hand, but the hook managed to grasp the flesh in a firm holding. With that, Percy pulled Sin out and kicked off Typhon's ribs, using his impulse to swing under the hand and then kick with his legs to complete a full rotation. He then willed the chain to disperse and fell onto Typhon's moving hand. It seemed that he caught the Titan's attention with that as the monster turned its gaze on him. That proved to be a mistake, as a pillar of rock measuring nearly 3 stories was literally thrown at the Titan, hitting him square on the chest and making him stumble back as Percy hunkered down to get a good grip. He glanced down to the arena floor to see the one tossing the stones was Rhea, using the pillars around her as ammunition. Once Typhon stabilized, Percy started running up the Titan's arm with both blades out. He coated them in his void fire as he sliced the hide under him while running, the black flames hungrily eating at hide and flesh exposed along the cuts as ichor flowed by the gallons and Typhon roared in rage and pain. Percy smirked, knowing that his flames were just as painful as the hellfire of Tartarus, and Typhon was now feeling pain like he never had before. The heat of being under Mount Etna and later St. Helens was nothing compared to this, and the best part was that the Titan's rapid healing wouldn't work on wounds from either of the divine fires. Percy soon arrived near Typhon's head as Talia and Andromeda peppered his chest with their arrows while Rhea focused more of her pillars onto Typhon's gut to keep his focus on them. Percy raced forward, his swords poised at his sides to slice at Typhon's head. He jumped, swords high, but the buffeting winds surrounding the monster's head took most of his momentum and forced him to squint. He made a wild swing just before the winds could push him away, his swords seeming to cut at Typhon's cheek close to his eye, making him screech in pain. Percy winced at the sound, but in doing so he failed to notice Typhon's hand grasp at him. He didn't have time to react to the Titan's suddenly fast grab and grunted as the monstrous strength tried to crush him. He could feel his ribs straining even as he flexed his arms to try and keep some space for himself to save his chest from being crushed in the hand of Typhon. He was strong, but this thing was only strength, and no one besides another full primordial could outmuscle the Titan. However, his team came to his rescue as Typhon abruptly released his grip, making Percy fall. As he fell, he glanced up to see the wrist of Typhon's right hand had been sliced open with a torrent of ichor flowing out. He then glanced to his side to see Jason falling not far from him, his sword stained golden as the former Roman shot him a grin. Percy returned a thankful nod as he corrected himself in the air, but they really didn't have anything to stop their fall unless Talia willed the winds to catch them. Unlikely, considering she and Andromeda were currently shooting at Typhon while hopping around to avoid being crushed underfoot. This is gonna sting, Percy thought as the arena floor rapidly approached them. He came down at terminal velocity, landing on a pillar only for the damn thing to give way under him, splitting down the center until he landed at the actual arena floor with a resounding crash, Jason not too far behind him. Percy groaned as his legs and back stung from the landing, but he shook it off in the dust on him while looking around. Jason was up as well, with revelation in arm as he scoped out a vulnerable spot to attack. Percy glanced up to smirk in satisfaction as Typhon's right arm and a piece of his face was burning with void fire, taking half of the Titan's eyesight and slowing down the use of his right arm tremendously, along with the useless hand that Jason nearly lopped off. No luck getting to his head, huh? Jason stated as he moved closer to him. Not really, the wind is too much, Percy replied before narrowing his eyes at Typhon's chest. I don't think we can get too close to his neck to slit his throat either, but, he trailed off as he thought of an idea. What's on your mind, Percy? Jason asked, knowing Percy's face when he thinks up something possibly reckless but usually useful. Well, we can't get to his head or neck, and Andromeda's arrows don't have enough power to fully pierce his chest and get to his heart. Our swords could, but with his height we just can't keep enough momentum to swing at full strength and carve his chest open, but if we did enough damage to open it up, Talia could possibly create a bolt strong enough to get to his heart. She'd need to hold off and focus for that, but then what's keeping Typhon's attention off her? Jason asked as both suddenly jumped to the side and onto another pillar as Typhon's foot nearly squashed them. He would notice the buildup of power and attack her. Then we need to keep his attention, Percy said with a smirk. Go let Thals and Andy know. Tell Andy to focus on Typhon's face while I let Rhea and Nico know. Where is he, by the way? Jason asked, but both stopped and looked to see Typhon stumble slightly and for the first time noticed that his right calf was on hellfire with multiple lacerations going up to midcalf with a black and red blur running around the Titan's foot. Found him, Percy said with a point before grinning. Let's join the party. Both nodded before surging forward again, Percy making a straight jump to Rhea as she hefted a locomotive-sized boulder and tossed it like a soft ball, the stone missile slamming into Typhon's head regardless of the wind, making him roar as more ichor spilled from a cut over his only usable eye since the other is long gone thanks to Percy's void fire. Nice toss, love, Percy greeted as he landed beside the former Titaness. Rhea huffed a bit while rolling her shoulder while glancing at him. Bastard just doesn't want to go down though. And that's why I was coming to tell you the plan, Percy said. If you and Nico can bring Typhon to a halt long enough, I can make some damage on his chest and give an opening for Talia to throw in the bigger fireworks. Rhea looked at him questioningly for a moment before she glanced at the Titan and narrowed her eyes. I think I might have just the thing, she said with a small smirk. Just wait for the opening, but it could be nice if you distract him for me. Will do, Percy agreed before rushing off to join Nico. D.A. Chapter 52, Typhoon Falls. 3. I think I might have just the thing, she said with a small smirk. Just wait for the opening, but it could be nice if you distract him for me. Will do, Percy agreed before rushing off to join Nico. He arrived quickly while glancing up to see purple arrows constantly striking Typhon around the collarbone, neck, and face, making him roar in frustration while trying to cover his face with his good hand, his right side being more of a hindrance as the void fire ate into more of his flesh, freezing it before it broke off in clumps of molten flesh and globs of sloshy ichor. It was still only skin-level damage at best and was only starting to get to Typhon's muscle. He disregarded it for now and arrived at Nico's side, the Blessed of Tartarus leaping across Typhon's calf as damnation sliced across the flesh while igniting it in purple hellfire, adding further damage to the Titan's leg. Yo Nico! He shouted as he stood a few meters away while keeping an eye on the Titan's arm swinging over them as the monster tried to cover his face from Andy's onslaught. What? Nico shouted as he swiped some sweat off his face. I'm busy at the moment. I can see that. Percy replied as he jumped high and drove both his swords into Typhon's knee, earning a very loud roar of pain as his void fire spread from the blades. Percy disengaged quickly and landed close to Nico, but both them leapt again and moved away as Typhon's hand nearly smashed them while the Titan looked for what caused him so much pain on just one leg. Hey, if my flames eat away enough, you think you can cut through his knee? Percy asked as Nico huffed beside him. Sure, I just need a higher vantage point since I can't jump as high as all of you guys since my physical ability is still just underneath godly level, he replied. Alright then, just wait for Ray's part and you should have an opportunity, he answered, getting a nod from Percy before the heir of Nyx jumped away to the front of Typhon. He could see Jason was on the Titan's shoulder again but was trying to avoid being caught like Percy had before. He pulled to a stop and glared up at the monster before flaring the flames on his blades. He then slashed at the air in front of him, blades of voidfire shooting off his swords at the monstrous Titan and impacting him on the chest, making him stumble slightly as the fires spread on his skin slowly. Percy clicked his teeth, having hoped that the blades of fire would manage to cut the skin as well to really get into his flesh, but apparently not. He was about to send another volley but then felt a spike in power and looked to see Rhea jumping onto a pillar of rock with her bow staff glowing green as it thrummed with power. It drew Typhon's attention when Percy saw Nico lunge from a rock outcropping near Typhon's burning foot, his blade roaring with hellfire. With a mighty heave, Nico cleaved across the back of Typhon's burning knee, the cut combining with the damage from Percy's earlier attack nearly causing the entire bottom half of the leg to rip off. Typhon roared in agony and surprise, lifting the injured leg in reflex, but it was that moment that Rhea attacked. Blasting off the ground, she roared as she swung Testament with all her immense strength, an explosion of pure power following as the end made contact with Typhon's left knee. A sickening crack followed as Typhon's kneecap was blown off in a shower of ichor and bone, making Percy smirk as he focused more of his power into his swords while watching the Titan fall. With all the pressure on one completely shattered knee, Typhon roared as it buckled and he fell to his knees, kicking up a massive dust cloud, but Percy remained still. He watched as the dust and ash dissipated as Typhon sat up while in obvious pain and looked directly at Percy with his one good eye. Percy smirked before muttering, "Let's see you take this." The flames coating his swords condensed before he brought both up and then with a roar, swung them down together with as much power as he could. His swing released a massive blade of black fire joined from the two swords, slicing through the rock and air around it as it sped towards the Titan faster than a missile. Typhon could only watch as the massive blade of voidfire spanning nearly 20 meters impacted his chest hard enough to push his immense body back with an explosion of pressure and flames as the blast minced through his thick hide. Typhon bellowed in sheer agony as the flames ate deep into the muscle and bone of his chest as a waterfall of ichor formed from an attack, making Zeus Master Bolt look like a firecracker. Then, just as he was trying to cover the largest wound he'd ever received, Percy spotted Jason jump straight up from Typhon's shoulder with his blade raised high as it crackled with white lightning. Percy watched as Jason fell back down and swung his blade, slicing past the thick hide and muscle along the Titan's shoulder, nearly severing the arm completely but still doing enough damage to make it useless. Then a larger than average purple arrow, nearly double the size of a ballista bolt, struck Typhon's other shoulder where Percy's fires had eaten away at the flesh, piercing clean through muscle and bone alike while cutting off the vital tendons of the arm. "Nice shot, Andy," Percy muttered as he took in the sight of the downed Titan. Armless, crippled legs, and a wound basically leaving his inner chest cavity exposed to all. Percy then looked behind him to the highest of the pillars left by Rhea, Talia standing there with a massive bolt of crackling lightning and churning winds forming a drill point aimed straight at Typhon. It seemed that Talia felt his gaze as she glanced at him. He nodded sternly at her and she nodded back before locking her gaze on the nearly dead Titan. With one final breath she pulled back her bolt the last stretch of her bow and released. The bolt sounded like 100 thunder cracks within a hurricane as the bolt flew towards Typhon. The monster could only look on, not even uttering a sound as the bolt struck him dead in the chest right over the heart. What followed was an explosion that felt akin to an atom bomb as Percy was forced to turn his gaze away to cover his face from the vicious winds and shockwaves, the air thrumming with electric charge making him feel almost numb along with a blinding flash. The roar of the explosion lasted for nearly 10 seconds before everything finally died down as Percy looked again to a sight no Olympian or Titan had ever thought possible. Typhon wasn't a single body anymore. His head and hips were what remained as his entire chest had been all but vaporized with the combined might of Percy's flames and Talia's bolt, his right leg mostly ash thanks to the still burning hellfire. Percy remained silent as he memorized the sight, their first true battle of this impending war and a victory thought impossible by most. The others soon gathered round, all looking on soberly as the gravity of what they've just accomplished settled on them. As they watched Typhon's body slowly starting to decay to golden dust, Talia thrust her hand out. In response, a bluish aura drifted off the growing piles of golden sand and drifting into Talia's hand. As she absorbed it, the sands started to turn white, marking the fading of an immortal. The law of succession needed only be used to strip immortality and domains not related to those held by the victor if they had them by chance. Talia was already the heir of sky and storms, Typhon's only domain that he was given when Gaia stole part of it from Uranus when Kronos cut him up. It was his only tie to retaining his form. Talia forcefully reclaiming his domain of storm and having so much of his essence destroyed by Percy's voidfire and Nico's hellfire, there was nothing left for the monster of a titan but to fade. With the last of the blue aura collected, Talia's power grew while all of the golden dust left from Typhon turned ashen white. It was done now. The greatest monster of Greek mythology was permanently erased and sent to the realm of the fated to be judged by Lady Chaos herself. With a tensed exhale, the group let their postures relax before some broke into massive grins, namely Percy himself, Jason, and Nico. "We fucking did it!" Jason shouted while raising his hands in triumph while Nico just whooped in agreement. "Hell yeah!" Percy agreed while pumping his fist, making Rhea giggle beside him and drawing his attention. "And where would we be without you knocking him down a peg or three?" Percy added before sweeping Rhea in his arms and claiming her lips much to her surprise. It didn't last long before she eagerly returned the kiss, escalating it into a full-blown makeout as her hands dug into his hair as he pulled her closer. He was so enraptured with her taste and soft whimpers as he bit at her lips that he nearly missed the throat being cleared, loudly. They both snapped out of the steamy embrace with flushed faces and heavy breaths to see their audience, including those that had watched the fight from a safe distance. Rhea blushed a little more while Percy sheepishly chuckled, much to the amusement of some, though Hades looked a bit uncomfortable having seen his mother make out with his one-upon-a-time nephew. Hestia was also blushing like crazy, but there was a curious glint to her eyes making Percy wink at her only for her to blush more and look away shyly. "Well," Nyx started while looking around as everyone settled down. "That was exceptional." "Exceptional?" Persephone asked incredulously as she clung to Hades' arm. "That was utter madness is what it was." "I think they did well enough," Tartarus added his 2 cents. "Badass!" Medusa exclaimed with glee next to a nodding Lamia. "Damn, my little bro and sis one-upped me there. Now I need to do something big or I'll get left behind," Hercules chuckled as he clapped Talia on the shoulder. "That was very exciting," Hemera added, though she grimaced slightly. "A bit more gore than I needed, but at least the brute is gone for good." "Very true," Ether agreed, but with a more sober tone. "And soon, so shall we." Everyone grew silent at that. Percy locked eyes with Nyx and saw that sadness again, knowing that she would miss them just as much as they would them. In the time together, everyone, not only the protogonoi and their heirs, had grown closer as a family. Their pasts put to rest in the effort to live and strive for the future, but sadly they could not all be together to see it through. With that though, Percy let go of Rhea before slowly walking to Nyx, all eyes on him as he kept a calm face. He stopped before her and looked down at her due to the difference in height. Wordlessly he brought her into a hug, her face partially buried into his chest as he rested his cheek against her raven locks. She soon returned the embrace and squeezed onto him as her frame shook slightly while she sniffed. He tightened his hold as she softly started to sob, and he felt his own eyes sting and his throat beginning to hurt as he spoke softly. "I guess it's finally time, huh, Mom?" Nyx only nodded as she sobbed harder before speaking in a muffled voice. "It really is, son." DA. Chapter 53. Protogonoi Rise I. They gathered together back at the courtyard. Percy and Nyx formed together, a sober atmosphere as everyone kept level faces. Beneath the great white oak were 8 thrones, each made of pitch black obsidian surrounded in ethereal auras. It would be their temporary thrones, being symbolic more than anything until they erected their true throne room on the surface. Percy stood in the middle of a line with his team and friends at his sides. Rhea, Andromeda, Jason, Talia, Phoebe, Styx, and Nico, each looking on at the thrones or the protogonoi that had trained them. To the side were their allies like Hercules, Medusa, Lamia, Leto, Mnemosyne, Damocin, Hades, Persephone, Hecate, Hestia, many of Nyx and Erebus' children such as Moros, Hypnos, and even Thantos. Not all their allies could attend, but it was a good showing regardless. Taking a breath, Nyx started off as she looked around. "It's been quite some time in the making, and now the time for a new era is dawning, and with it, as primordial gods must move on. She then looked intently at Percy with clear love in her eyes as she spoke in a tender tone. Percy, I just want you to know that I cherished the years I had you with me. Getting to see you grow beyond all expectations and having a semi-mortal and somewhat normal son has made me the happiest I've ever been in millennia ever since Erebus passed on. Her breath hitched for a moment as she rubbed away a stray tear. I've never been prouder to name you my heir and having the honor of calling you my son. He smiled back at her as he stepped up to her and gave her one last hug which she eagerly returned. They held it for a minute. Once he let go, Nyx stood on her toes and gave him a kiss on the forehead before stepping back slightly and nodding to him. He took a shaky breath before he nodded as well, flaring his power before speaking in a commanding voice. My name is Perseus Theseus Jackson, heir of Nyx, primordial of night, and Erebus, primordial of darkness and shadows. Does anyone dispute my right? There was absolute silence, so he continued. Henceforward I claim my place as primordial of night, darkness, and shadows. Once he finished, there was another flare of power before Nyx shuddered slightly as a glowing orb of power as black as a starless night phased out of her along with a second formed of churning darkness. The cores, or full essence of Nyx and Erebus, their links to their domains and true power, came to Percy and phased into his body. He suddenly grunted as a searing pain flooded his system, the air around him literally steaming as the darkness of the pit writhed and coiled at the presence of their new master. Soon it all condensed before he gave a shout as he felt the power within him explode in a black light, making those around him have to squint and guard their faces while stepping back. When the thrum of power died down, Percy panted as he got up from his knees, feeling the power of Nyx and Erebus fully merge and synchronize with him. He looked at his own hand in wonder, awed at how his power grew nearly tenfold. He was no mere mortal or lowly god now. He is a primordial, a god linked to a facet of creation, a being capable of creating, reshaping, and destroying worlds, and his power would only grow once his full domains got instated by Phoebe. The Olympians truly were lucky. They have no idea how powerful Gaia would have been if she had been able to access her full power right off the bat. But now, a power greater than hers is mine, he thought as he clenched his fist. He then caught some gasps and looked behind him to see his friends all staring at him with open jaws. What? He asked, but all they did was point at his back. He glanced back and nearly shouted in surprise at the sight. Being a complete primordial had given him the last feature to mark him, a set of feathered, pitch-black wings. Each feather looked as soft as velvet and seemed to absorb even the tiniest hints of light as they ruffled slightly in a breeze as a cool mist drifted off them. He experimentally twitched them and they responded naturally before he expanded them completely. Each wing was nearly 3 meters in length and looked similar to those of ravens. Beautiful, he heard Hestia murmur from her place off to the side, and he could tell she wasn't the only one admiring his new additions. He would have experimented further, but a tired sigh caught his attention, making him look to see Nyx, but now she looked different. Her hair had lost its luster and her skin looked far too pale as her eyes seemed to dim. She started to fall, but he rushed to her in a moment and caught her in his arms with a bridal carry as she looked at him. You make a very handsome primordial, did you know that? She asked softly as she weakly reached with one hand and trailed it through one of his wings over his shoulder. My, Rhea and Hestia will love these, I'm almost jealous, she said with a small giggle before focusing back on his face. Good luck, Percy. I know you'll succeed in the end, so carry on. Remember, I'll always be watching on from the realm of the fated. Yeah, I know you will, he replied softly as a lone tear trailed down his cheek which Nyx rubbed away with her thumb. She smiled weakly at him before he planted a soft kiss on her forehead, making her smile more. But then slowly her eyes closed as her body started to glow. A breeze seemed to pick up and trail over her as her body started to turn to a familiar dust, but instead of looking like ash it turned into a bright, almost glowing white powder that was carried away into the wind. He watched as his second mother's body turned to dust in his arms, moving on as he remained silent. Then, he quietly walked towards one of the middle thrones and took his seat, his power rolling off him in waves as he looked back at everyone else. Looks of awe and admiration were directed at him, making him smile warmly. Sure, he just lost his second mother, but he knew she was in a better place and finally reunited with her husband. Being sad wouldn't help him, so instead he embraced her passing and promised himself to make her proud. He then looked on to the other protagonoi and nodded, asking for them to continue. Rhea responded as she stepped forward. Unlike most, she only needed to state her claim, no emotional toil whatsoever considering her mother was killed by Percy some time ago. Rhea took a deep breath before repeating the process Percy did. I am Rhea, former titaness of motherhood, mountain wilds, and fertility, heiress of Gaia, primordial of earth. Does anyone dispute my right? Again silence met her, so she continued. Henceforward I claim my place as primordial of earth. As she said it like Percy, she glowed in tones of green power, Gaia's core, having been in her for some time, as the ground and entire pit shook. From the look on some of the gods' faces he guessed that even the surface world was feeling earthquakes as the new master of the planet took her place. When the glow died down, it revealed Rhea on one knee and like Percy, with a new addition of wings reminiscent of large eagle wings. The feathers were mainly dark brown, but some of the feather edges were emerald green, and with their fluttering there was a near gravely sound coming off them. Rhea took in her new additions in stride as she smiled at them before walked up and taking a seat to Percy's left, both now occupying the two center thrones which would soon be their place as king and queen of the new council. Jason came up next, looking at Ether and Hemera, who gave him encouraging smiles to which he nodded back in appreciation. He took a loose stance and tried to relax his shoulder before muttering, now or never, to himself, even though Percy could more or less read his lips. I am Jason Grace, heir of Ether, primordial of upper atmosphere and light, and Hemera, primordial of day. Does anyone dispute my right? Then I claim my place as primordial of light, day, and upper atmosphere. Once he finished, the same that happened to Nyx happened to Ether and Hemera as their cores of power, two miniature stars, drifted into Jason, making him glow in a blinding light as he also gave a shout of pain. Once the light died down, Jason was revealed panting and not surprisingly, with pure white wings making him look like a true angel. His feathers though looked almost phantasmal, radiating light as small, near imperceptible crackles of electricity trailed between the feathers. He got over self-inspecting though as Ether fell to a knee with Hemera leaning on him, both having lost their glow as Jason rushed to them. Ether chuckled before muttering, damn, I feel like I had too much of Granny Chaos, special brew and an ass kicking to match. Hemera giggled weakly as Jason gave a tired sigh even as he smiled at the pair before brining both into a hug. I'm going to miss you both, it truly was an honor, he said, but Ether shook his head. No, the honor was ours, the once primordial said before Hemera added, and we don't regret a moment of it. But Jason, she said as her face got a little more serious as she placed a hand over his heart. Don't be scared of this, okay? Take it as a last request from me and try to find love again. You've recovered a lot, but you still need to be willing to open up again, otherwise you'll be lonely for a long time and I don't want that for you. Jason looked a little uncomfortable with the subject, but he nodded nonetheless, making Hemera smile at him. She then gave him a last kiss on the cheek as Ether clapped the new primordial on the back, and then the couple stood back as they started to turn to white dust as well with a gentle breeze. Once they were gone, silence reigned as Jason sniffed slightly before standing tall and making his way to a throne a seat away to Percy's right, leaving an empty throne between them. Andromeda came next as she looked at Eros and Phanes, both protogonoi looking at the brunette with clear pride in their eyes as they nodded to her. Go on, young one. You've already made us proud, so hold your head high. The world awaits, Eros said to Phane's approving look, making Andromeda smile shyly before she took a breath and repeated the process. My name is Andromeda Xena Jackson, heiress of Eros, primordial of love and attraction, and Phanes, primordial of procreation and desire. Does anyone dispute my right? Then I claim my place as primordial of love, attraction, desire, and procreation. As she finished, she gave a soft glow of pink and purple energy, even as Percy and the others felt the power coming off her, being nothing to scoff at. Once the glow fell, Andromeda appeared with wings similar to those of Eros and Phanes, though they had a mix of purple and pink feathers. Giving a quick once-over, she made her way to Eros and Phanes as both groaned while supporting each other, their skin getting remarkably pale. Damn, Ether wasn't kidding, Phanes grumbled as Eros chuckled. What were you expecting? Sudden weightlessness and a little tingling before moving on. Eros asked, making Phanes scowl at him. Even at your deathbeds you both argue, Andy sighed before hugging the twins. I'll miss you both and your antics. But of course you will, we're awesome, Phanes replied as they returned the embrace. You're going to make a wonderful goddess of love, Eros added. So make sure to keep an eye out for your brother and company, okay? He asked as Andy nodded. With that, the pair stepped back and also began to fade as Andy wiped away her tears while giving them a sad smile. Once they were fully gone, she went and took a seat to Jason's right, leaving the throne to Percy's right still empty, but it was reserved for a special case. Next their eyes turned to Talia, the ex-hunter, stepping forward before Uranus while nervously opening and closing her hands. Go on, Talia, the king of the skies said gently, making his heiress calm slightly as she nodded before speaking. My name is Talia Grace, heiress of Uranus, primordial of the heavens. Does anyone dispute my right? Then I claim my place as primordial of the heavens. With her declaration near hurricane-level winds surged around her with thunder booming around them making their hair whip around wildly. Percy ignored it though as he focused on Talia's form as the wind slowly died out to reveal her with gray and blue wings crackling with electricity. Talia glanced back at them for only a moment before she moved to Uranus and caught him before he could fall. Uranus gave an old and tired chuckle as he leaned on Talia while looking at her. You know, if I have any regrets, it is that I couldn't spend as much time with you as some of my siblings had with their heirs, he said as Talia gave him a small smile. Well, if it is any consolation, I think you were more awesome in those few years, she said even if Percy could see the hint of sadness in her eyes. Even if it had been a few years, actually over a decade since Uranus had applied the same time distortion to his palace that Tartarus had to gain enough time to properly train her, Uranus had been more of a father than Zeus had ever been for Talia. But now her foster father was leaving her but she still had Percy himself and all the others, her family, to stand with her from now on. Uranus chuckled a little more at Talia's statement before sighing as his body also started to turn to white dust but not before he straightened up and gave her a kiss on the forehead. With that he finally dispersed as Talia wiped away a tear or two and stood straight before walking to her throne to raise left, leaving two remaining to Talia's left, one between Jason and Percy, and the last to Andromeda's right. Next came Phoebe as she stepped up dressed in a white and gray chiton, her hair flowing free as her amber eyes seemed to look up beyond the sky. She took a breath before stating her claim. I am Adra's Phoebe, titaness of bright intellect and prophecy, heiress of Anarchy, primordial of inevitability, compulsion, and necessity. Does anyone dispute my right? Then I claim my place as primordial of inevitability, compulsion, and necessity. As she finished, a pure wave of power exploded off her as time and space seemed to distort around her for a second, nearly causing their audience to fall to their knees save Tartarus while the new protogonoi smirked slightly. Phoebe wasn't as experienced at containing the power of a primordial much to the struggles of those watching while the new protogonoi shrugged it off. Phoebe also gained a set of wings but these seemed to be more ethereal with ghostly colors of green and very light blue. Once done inspecting, Phoebe walked to the throne next to Talia but instead of sitting she remained standing. The other new protogonoi stood as well and looked at each other before proceeding to the next step. Phoebe, Percy said in a powerful voice that seemed to demand respect as the darkness of the pit responded to his beck and call. Continue. She nodded before beginning to speak as her eyes glowed a light green, a similar glow surrounding Percy first. Hail! Perseus Theseus Jackson, primordial of night, darkness, shadows, and cold. King of the Protogonoi Council. Lord of Wolves. Phoebe finished as another wave of power erupted off Percy while his eyes widened as the new domains took their place with him. D.A. Chapter 54, Protogonoi Rise 2. Hail! Perseus Theseus Jackson, primordial of night, darkness, shadows, and cold. King of the Protogonoi Council. Lord of Wolves. Phoebe finished as another wave of power erupted off Percy while his eyes widened as the new domains took their place with him. A new domain, a conceptual one at that, added an unprecedented amount of power as he felt his control and awareness grow even stronger in the frozen lands of the earth. He could also feel the presence of wolves around the world and he could swear he could hear them collectively howling to the night at the recognition of their new master. He remained silent for a minute as he absorbed all the new input while the air around him flash froze for a moment. He then sighed while rolling his shoulders and looking to the other protogonoi who looked thoroughly godsmacked. He would have given a sheepish chuckle but Phoebe wasn't stopping as she spoke again, this time the glow surrounding Rhea. Hail! More is Rhea, primordial of earth and nature. Queen of the Protogonoi Council. Lady of Lions. Like Percy, Rhea had a pulse of power come off her and Percy was reminded of the time he spent in Pan's presence before the god faded as an aura of peace and life radiated off her. Her aura was so enriching that real plants, unlike the fake ones Percy made for the garden, sprouted at her feet. Rhea smiled at her full declaration of their domains. After a moment Phoebe turned to Jason and continued on. Hail! Jason Grace, primordial of light, day, upper atmosphere. As she finished Jason glowed only for a moment but far more subdued, though he looked a little lackluster but then again he didn't have a natural animal like Percy and Rhea though then again, the others didn't either. It was rare as is to have a natural sacred animal rather than a claimed animal. After Jason came Talia. Hail! Talia Grace, primordial of heaven and storms. Talia was around surrounded by another ragging wind for a moment before she sighed and relaxed while Phoebe turned her attention to Andromeda. Hail! Andromeda Xena Jackson, primordial of love, desire, procreation, and attraction. As with the others, Andromeda had another pulse of power come off her before she remained standing straight. With all the heirs fully claimed and placed, the new council directed their attention to the center as Styx walked up to them. The Titaness of the River of Hate fidgeted with nervous energy, her green and black streaked eyes looking at each of them for a moment or so before switching. Her dark green hair seeming to churn with the same waters of her river flowed around her while her hands played with the strings tied around her black chitin. Maris Styx, Percy started, gaining the Titan's attention as she stood straighter, though in fear or respect Percy wasn't too sure. You are called before the Primordial Council to ascend to our ranks as a new seat. Do you accept? He asked, to which she slowly nodded. Percy smirked before all the protogonoi raised a hand and aimed it at her as they started to speak in the ancient tongue of the primordial gods as Styx was surrounded in a glow of power. Soon the glow was blinding before it exploded in a wave of power. Once released, Styx stood with an air of a primordial, wings of seemingly solid green and black water resting at her back as Phoebe spoke. Hail! Maris Styx, primordial of the river Styx, hate, and oaths. With Phoebe's words, the birth of a completely new primordial was complete. Styx smiled before she walked and stood before the seat next to Phoebe, leaving the throne to Percy's right and the last to Andromeda's right empty. Percy glanced at Nico before speaking. Nico, I know you can't take your place as a full primordial yet, but I think you are more than clear to claim the title of heir, he said as Nico glanced at Tartarus. The last elder primordial nodded, to which Nico responded by walking up to the center before speaking. I, Nico D'Angelo, state my claim and right to be heir of Tartarus, primordial of the pit. With his words, a combination of elements ranging from darkness and purple flames to the ground shaking beneath them along with the pit surrounded Nico. The protogonoi watched as the new demiprimordial's power spiked to godly levels. Once the elements calmed, Nico was visible again with an even stronger aura of malevolence around him, but with a new addition. Around his neck was a black steeled pendant with what looked like a ruby in the center glowing within an ethereal red. His manifestation of power, Percy thought while also wondering what abilities the pendant carried. Nico self-inspected himself for a moment while Percy glanced to Tartarus, noticing the nearly hidden slouch the elder primordial now had. No going back with the next phase, Percy mused before looking at Rhea to his left, and after exchanging a nod, she spoke. Era Hestia, Rhea called, making the goddess in question jump slightly while the others looked on curiously. Please step forward. Hestia gulped at the commanding voice of her mother but did so, walking slowly while looking at each new primordial in apprehension as their audience remained rather silent. Once in the center, she stopped as Percy decided it was his turn to speak. Hestia, he said in a warm tone as the goddess locked eyes with him. You've been a quiet observer to the time of the Olympians and always helped keep the peace. Though few ever noticed you, you were key to maintaining hope even in the gravest of circumstances. You were also humble and able to set aside your pride as a goddess to set a balance in the Olympian Council. But now to us, hope is needed more than anything. We are about to go to war and the trust in our family matters above all. That is why I ask you, would you accept a new seat among the Primordial Council? If Hestia's eyes could get any wider, Percy wasn't sure, but it looked like she was damn well trying. He had to suppress a chuckle at her face, lest she think he was joking. However, he and the other protogonoi remained rather stern though not unkind as they waited for the goddess to process the invitation. It took several minutes before Hestia finally shook off the shock before looking directly back at Percy again. Are you sure? She asked in a near whisper. I mean, She trailed off as she looked down at her feet, her frame shaking slightly, making Rhea sigh with a small and understanding smile. She then walked forward towards Hestia and brought the younger goddess into a gentle hug before speaking softly. Hestia, you have no idea just how important you are to not only Percy and I but all of us. We want you with us, to be our warmth and guidance. So, what do you say? Hestia kept shaking for a bit before slowly looking up, showing that she had been crying silently, but the warm smile on her face told Percy that those were happy tears. To being finally recognized and accepted rather than the quiet goddess dismissed by most of her family for several millennia. Yes, she replied, making Rhea beam before giving her a quick kiss on the forehead. Rhea stepped back to her throne and turned as the protogonoi gave Hestia encouraging smiles before raising their hands again. The chanted once more in the primordial language as Hestia was surrounded in a red and orange surge of divine power, the air around them starting to steam around them. They wrapped up the chant, but just as they lowered their hands, Percy's eyes widened as he felt the surge of power coming. With a flick of his wrist, a wall of darkness surged before their audience as several of the other protogonoi raised their own defense, mostly covering themselves with their wings. Not a moment too soon, an explosion of the strongest Greek fire Percy had ever felt burst around Hestia. Percy, even being immune to fire damage thanks to Hestia's blessing from so long ago, felt the heat surrounding him to the point of mild discomfort. The blaze died down in a few seconds and he glanced around at the others that rested their wings, none looking hurt at all even though some of their wings were steaming. Percy also lowered the wall of darkness, cutting off their audience before focusing back on Hestia. His jaw almost dropped as he looked at her again, but this time really looked at her. Her once brunette hair was now nearly as black as his own, but with orange and red glowing tips reaching her mid-back. Her light skin had gained a tanner complexion while her irises were glowing in deep tones of red flame similar to his black flaming eyes, while her pupils became narrow while remaining dark. Her modest chin became far more form-fitting, hugging her curves in ways that made him focus on his self-control. And lastly, on her back were a pair of wings looking like a fusion of bright red feathers and scales. Each scale covering the top gleamed in deep crimson with waves of heat radiating off them as a polar opposite to the cool darkness dissipating around Percy's raven wings. While Percy continued to imprint the sight before him to his mind permanently, Phoebe shook her head a little before clearing her throat. That broke Percy's stupor as he glanced at the new primordial of fate as Phoebe spoke. Hail, Era Hestia, primordial of hope, unity, and fire. Second Queen of the Protogonoi Council. Lady of Dragons. Percy's jaw dropped again at the mention of Hestia's domains as well as her newest title. Dragons. Of all the sacred animals to naturally attain, Hestia had to get the rarest. There were few true dragons in Greek mythology, but the few known were some of the most powerful, latent chief among them. Hestia herself marveled at herself before looking at Percy again with a more confident air around her. Percy smiled at her before glancing at the empty throne beside him. Hestia smiled as she walked up to it and sat down, looking as though she was born to be on that throne. With her sitting, so did the others before their audience stepped closer themselves, looking on in awe. Percy smirked slightly before he cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. Once he had it, he spoke calmly. Now that the new council is formed, be ready. He then moved his hands to his sides and took a hand from Hestia and Rhea each, getting a reassuring squeeze from both. Our war is about to begin. D.A. Chapter 55, New Home I. The night sky was cloudless as millions of tiny stars glittered in the perfectly black canvas. The winds barely above the gentlest breeze, a cool caress to any out at the hour as the new moon remained hidden. Looks like the huntress isn't out tonight. Good, a feminine figure thought as she looked out over a sheer cliff. Below her was an immense valley nestled between the Rockies and prairies beyond. Her raven hair drifted slightly with the wind reached the back of her coppery thighs. Her athletic and full figure was barely hidden away by a short, strapless and sleeveless black dress that reached mid-thigh with slits at the sides reaching her hips for movement. She wore black Dracon leather boots reaching just above her knees with slight heels and Tartarian steel toes. Along her arms she wore separate sleeves with black void crystal bracers and fingerless gloves. Tied at her hip was a long black chain with twin barbed knives each reaching a foot in length. Lastly were her bright green eyes like those of snakes staring out into the still night as she hummed to herself. This woman was none other than one of the most dangerous and recognized monsters of Greek mythology, made lethal with her training and new pledge. This is Medusa. At times she would open and close her hands, still experimenting with her newfound strength. Her oath taken only days ago after the new council formed, and the consequences of such a pledge. 2 days ago. Medusa and Lamia stood side to side in their combat attire. Lamia being in a similar dress to Medusa only with the addition of a black leather jacket and void crystal bracers and shoulder guards, while her bow formed of Tartarian steel was strapped to her back. Her creamy skin and bright blue eyes contrasting to her pitch black hair. Both stood straight and proud before their savior, their king, and not really secret crush, Percy. He looked at the pair sternly as well as a small table between them and 2 goblets of Stygian iron. Inside the cups was bright green water provided directly by Lady Styx rather than obtained from her river. Medusa would have been lying if she said she wasn't nervous. Percy, along with all the other new protogonoi, had such an overwhelming presence now, even when suppressed, and it made her instincts go haywire. Part of her wanted to kneel and grovel, knowing she was beneath him in every sense of the word, while another part of her wanted to jump him and be beneath him in all the right ways. Only her very rational fear of Rhea and now Hestia kept her at bay from trying, even though knowing Percy would never be unfaithful. A rather annoying but positive aspect of his that she honestly loved even if it was working against her at the moment. She glanced to the side and noted that Lamia was also shuffling nervously with a shy glance directed at her king. If it wasn't the wrong time for it, Medusa would have teased her mercilessly, but now they stood at attention as Percy cleared his throat. Medusa, Lamia, he said in a rich and deep voice, making her shudder. Are you two ready for this? To swear your undying loyalty to me, for better or for worse, until the very end of days. Medusa and Lamia shared one glance before facing him without an ounce of doubt in their eyes as they said together. We swear. Percy looked at them intently before nodding and bringing up his hand to his mouth. He bit down on his palm, making use of his fangs as platinum ichor. Another defining feature of these new protogonoi, dripped off his palm and into the two cups equally. The green water within the cups hissed as the platinum and green liquid swirled in a perfect balance. Percy soon stopped and Medusa watched as his injury healed within moments as shadows condensed around it before he picked up the cups and offered one to each. Medusa took hers along with Lamia and the pair looked into the cups before downing them together. Medusa suddenly felt a burning pain surge through her veins, but she bit her lips to prevent herself from screaming as her frame shook, Lamia not doing much better. The shadows writhed and withered around them, frost forming beneath their feet as their veins glowed in tones of gold. The agony only lasted for a few seconds, but it felt like so much longer before she suddenly dropped to her knees panting, the darkness around them calming as well. Sweat trailed off her brow as she looked up to the sound of Percy chuckling softly. She met his flaming black eyes as he looked at them with pride and care before he spoke. Well down, ladies, your oaths are cemented. No longer are you mere monsters or even gods, he said as he dropped to one knee and cupped each of their chins to keep their faces aimed at him even as both tried to suppress their blushes. You are now my right and left hands, my wraiths, my shadows. Present. They were fully bonded to Percy now. Ichor flowed through their veins as they inherited abilities similar to their one and only master along with any gift obtained from their oaths. Medusa's strength rose to godly levels as well as her aptitude for swords, while Lamia gained the senses and stamina of wolves, making her a perfect huntress capable of tracking any target for hundreds of miles if needed. I wonder if we will start hunting soon, she thought with a small smirk before her senses picked up a familiar presence approaching as she turned her eyes to the night sky. The fluttering of feathers and powerful beats forewarned the arrival of whom she searched for, making her smile softly. There approached a magnificent white stallion with wings as grand as the rising dawn. She stepped back to allow some space as her son, the first and original Pegasus, landed before her in all his grandeur. His muscles coiled underneath his glowing coat as he turned to face her while tucking in his wings. His blackened muzzle, eyes, and hooves being the only thing to blemish his white coat and wings. She watched as her son took her in after being separated from her for millennia thanks to her curse and presence befitting that of a monster. For some tense minutes they stood unmoving, but then, with a small snort, her son approached steadily. She made no move until her son, standing at 6 feet at the shoulder and his head towering over her, brought his head down and tenderly nuzzled her cheek. It made her smile the way only a mother could before she gently hugged his muzzle to her as he stepped closer. My son, she said softly as she stroked his neck. You've certainly grown. She got an appreciative snort out of it before she leaned back slightly and looked directly. I don't know what the years have been like with your father, she spat out Poseidon's role in disgust. But I ask now, would you stand by me instead? They locked eyes as she said that. No words needed to be said between them as their emotions seemed to pass through their touch. She could tell he'd missed her but had never been able to approach her, being forbidden by the gods ever since his birth. She had also been a monster for some time and being filled with so much hate only made her presence more intolerable for him, but now she was different. The proof was in how he found her in only hours after she came to the surface for the first time in nearly a decade. Her own love for her child and wish to form that maternal bond with him passed into him, letting him know that she cared little for how or why he was conceived, only that she loved him regardless. It was all made clear between the pair before her son snorted again and then nuzzled her in yes, making her beam. She then leaned up on her toes and kissed his forehead, but more happened. From her kiss a darkness like the richest ink spread through his coat. All the while he stood still, comforted in the warmth and presence of his mother as the darkness spread over him. The very night seemed to stir around them as the darkness seeped into Pegasus before he jerked slightly but relaxed soon once Medusa soothed him. Soon the darkness and shadows dispersed, but now Pegasus was reborn. His coat now being as black as Percy in his wolf form and similar raven wings, Pegasus' eyes being icy blue completely as frost seemed to form along the ground beneath his hooves. Medusa looked at her son in pride and felt their connection deepen to the point she took her hands off him and could still read his emotions to understand him. Her son looked at himself before rearing on his back legs proudly, approving of his new form as she smiled. You look good, my son, now, you know where to go, she said before receiving a nod and quick nuzzling before Pegasus turned around. He thundered off the cliff and took to the night sky, his new home as his body became one with the darkness. She watched him fly away with pride before she sighed as she looked down. The shadows seemed to seep together to form a puddle below her before she sank, leaving the cliff without a trace. D.A. Chapter 56. New Home 2. He thundered off the cliff and took to the night sky, his new home as his body became one with the darkness. She watched him fly away with pride before she sighed as she looked down. The shadows seemed to seep together to form a puddle below her before she sank, leaving the cliff without a trace. The shadows condensed to form Medusa again as she arrived at a familiar garden. She turned to the site of the infamous tree of golden apples. Off to the side the four Hesperides stood slack-jawed with a grinning Percy beside them, his wings hidden and hood up to hide his face for the time being as they all stared at the tree. Still wrapped around the tree was Ladon, but the massive dragon's 100 heads all were trained to the same spot. Sitting comfortably on the grass was Hestia with several of Ladon's heads resting around her, one even curled up partially on her lap as giving the dragon equivalent of a purr as Hestia, her wings also hidden, giggled and scratched the dragon's nose. Medusa chuckled with amusement as she walked to Percy's side and watched as Hestia seemed to whisper to Ladon, the dragon purring and blowing snorts of approval before she, like Medusa had before, kissed his nose. From the kiss a crimson flame spread over Ladon, but the dragon made no gesture of alarm. Soon the entire dragon's body was awash with the flames for several seconds without actually burning the floor or tree even as the temperature rose to the point the Hesperides were all sweating while Percy and Medusa remained as cool as cucumbers. After the flames dispersed, Ladon was revealed with a new color. His scales gleamed like molten rubies with steam billowing off the dragon, his glowing orange eyes taking himself in. Then the massive dragon stood up, the ground trembling at his movement as he uncoiled himself from the tree for the first time since being posted as the guard. Then, with a swipe of his left foreclaw, the dragon unearthed the tree, roots and all, before picking it up with several heads while the largest of the heads turned to face Hestia. She nodded as she waved her hand as a portal of fire opened before him, raising the ambient temperature even more. Good thing Percy erected a barrier to hide power for this, or else the Olympians would have come running. Ladon didn't hesitate to walk through the portal, heading to the same location Medusa had sent Pegasus to. Once the dragon was through, the portal closed and Hestia walked up to Percy, the silent Hesperides watching on in stunned silence. Hestia giggled at Percy's smirk before giving him a quick kiss, making Medusa a little jealous, but she kept it hidden as the pair separated. We'll be waiting, Hestia said before she disappeared in a swirl of fire, making Medusa breathe a little easier thanks to Hestia's chosen form of transport. Hestia was still new to the power. She had intended to burn her surroundings when flashing, so she stuck to flame teleportation for now, not that any of the new protogonoi were much better at the moment. So, Medusa started as she glanced at the stunned girls with their eyes glued to the former location of Hera's little tree. What now? Now, I make good on my promise to Atlas, Percy said as he started to walk, and Medusa fell in step behind him and slightly to his right. She could hear the Hesperides shake themselves from their surprise and start to follow them, making Medusa curious, so she leaned closer and whispered to Percy. So why aren't they calling to Olympus or anything, since we basically took the only reason they are here? Hestia convinced them that her sister wanted the tree moved. They weren't that hard to convince to stay quiet, and they don't remember the last time I was here. Now I think they're just too curious to see what I'll do to bother contacting the Olympians, he replied under his breath, too low for anyone other than Medusa to hear. She nodded in understanding as they made their way up the mountain into Atlas, the Titan still in his personalized prison while turned to their direction. No doubt that he sensed the spikes in power with Ladon's change in the portal, but then his eyes fell on Percy's approaching form. So, you've returned, the Titan said, sounding surprised that Percy actually kept his word. Of course, Percy said before grinning as Atlas got a good read to his new power as Percy got close enough, even while suppressed. Medusa snickered as the Titan paled, probably now just realizing just how much of a threat Percy was. Granted, at the moment he only felt like a strong Titan on par with Kronos. Now that she thought about it as she glanced back at the Hesperides, the four seemed to be standing on shaky legs while giving nervous glances to Percy. My, it seems my king has become quite the imposing figure, she thought while barely restraining herself from licking her lips. She shook off those thoughts though before focusing back on Percy and Atlas. So, get ready to move over a little, Percy said casually as he walked up to the Titan's side. Without warning, Percy gave Atlas a shoulder shove, pushing the surprised Titan a couple of meters away while he barely kept himself from falling over. All the while Percy grunted a little as the weight of the skies dropped on him alone, barely even getting him to slouch. Atlas approached with an incredulous look, eyeing Percy up and down. Just who are you? Atlas asked with suspicion in his voice. Nothing short of a god could hold that, and certainly none bare Hercules or myself could with such ease. Oh please, Percy said as he looked at Atlas. First off, Olympus used to hold the skies with his thoughts alone, and it was your father with his three brothers that wanted to play with the big kids, so Olympus divided the task between them. I can handle it easily. But who are you? Atlas persisted as his daughters neared him while still looking at Percy and now Medusa nervously. Percy hummed before grinning, his fangs flashing as he spoke again. First, that one order. I order you, Atlas, to take the portal open for you, and upon arrival, you will swear on the sticks to serve Rhea faithfully until she deems you fit to release from service. Atlas looked enraged at the trick but was stunned into silence as Percy flicked his hood back, letting Atlas see his face for the first time since all those years ago. Yep, it's been a while big guy, but we can catch up later. With that, a portal of shadows formed behind Atlas, and before he could try to protest in any way, Medusa moved. Launching herself like a cannonball, she dashed forward and jumped at Atlas before he could even notice her. With both feet she kicked Atlas in the chest, surprising the Titan with her strength and sending him careening back through the portal before he could so much as utter a sound. Did you need to do that? Percy asked in amusement as she looked back at him and grinned. I didn't want to hear him complaining about being unfair, she replied sweetly before looking at the silent Hesperides. And you girls can follow after your father. Why? What are you going to do with us? One of them asked with narrowed eyes, but Medusa could tell that all four were terrified at the moment. Well, do you really want to stick around? Medusa asked with a shrug. Your father isn't here and you can't guard the tree, just makes me wonder what will happen with you four in the hands of the Olympians now without any excuse. That got to them as all four shiver in fear and disgust, knowing the more than likely treatment they would receive if taken to Olympus. Okay, another one said as all four moved through the portal. Once they were gone, Percy allowed it to close before looking at Medusa again. You didn't need to scare them like that, he said in a slightly reprimanding tone, but she replied with a pout. I wasn't lying though, she defended, getting a shrug from him. So what now? She asked as she moved closer to him while looking out at the city off the mountain. We wait, Rhea and Talia will handle the rest, he said as he rolled his arms to get them in a more comfortable position. Fine, she drawled out as she sat down in front of him, and the pair remained silent for a while. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. So wanna play I Spy? D.A. Chapter 57, New Home 3. With Rhea. So this is it. Rhea looked over her shoulder to Talia as the pair continued to walk through a large clearing as a cool wind blew, the evergreens swaying slightly. Yep. We are making home here, she replied as she returned her attention to the clearing before her and scanning the flat land going on for miles in every direction. But Canada? Talia asked as she stepped up beside Rhea. What's wrong with Canada? Rhea retorted with a raised eyebrow. Nothing, just. Talia paused as she searched for words. I don't know. Why not Quebec or something like that? We are in the middle of Ontario with nothing for over 100 miles in any direction. That's true, but it's a perfectly strategic location, she replied easily. We are out in the wilderness, which is my turf now. Canada has more and longer nights along with the cold, meaning Percy will always have the advantage here, but in the summer Jason will, and it's too far for the Olympians to have influence, making it risky for them to even think about attacking us themselves. Won't stop them from sending armies, Talia retorted, but Rhea only grinned. Armies marching hundreds miles of wild terrain and at the mercy of the elements and wild animals along with any defenses we form. By all means, let them attack, she said before focusing on the land before her. Now give me some silence please. Talia snorted in a reply, but Rhea ignored it before she focused on the earth beneath her. She could feel the hum of life and power beneath her feet, both from the ground itself and the wildlife surrounding them. She could make out millions of little vibrations and movement made from the smallest animals and humans in the closest settlement to the very shift of the tectonic plates responding to her whim. Then, as she slowly raised one hand, the earth around them shook as the life around her seemed to hold still with bated breath. A massive fissure rivaling some of the largest canyons started to form in front of her before a mountain started to jut out of the divided earth. She maintained her focus all the while suppressing a smirk at the sight of Talia beside her, the younger goddess looking on, godsmacked as the mountain grew before them and taking up the entire clearing and beyond. Rhea felt a few beads of sweat forming on her brow as she felt the earth around them tremble and move to allow the whole mountain to reveal itself. Some parts of the rock faces blackened and scorched, but there was nothing to be done about it. After all, she was raising this mountain from the very plains of Tartarus. After nearly an hour, the whole mountain stood before them, making them crane their heads up to even try to see the top. Rhea took another breath before she focused on the mountain while raising her hands together as if holding it before tearing them apart. At her motion, entire chunks of rock were violently torn off the mountain face and sides with billowing clouds of dust and gravel. Talia waved her hand, making a powerful gust to remove all the dust, only to be stunned again at what was now revealed. Hidden by the exterior rock as a protective shell now removed, Talia could see a winding path reminiscent of a snake curled up and leading from them up to the mountain top. As wide as a 3-lane highway and with a gentle incline before the very top seemed to run into a dead end 2/3 of the mountain. Come on, Rhea said as she willed her wings to appear before jumping and with a powerful beat, rose high into the sky. Talia tailed her quick enough and soon they were several thousand feet in the air facing the mountain face, the end of the path a ways under them. Why does the path stop into the mountain face? Talia asked, but only got a sly smile from Rhea as a response. This is why, Rhea answered as she waved her hand, and like a broken egg, the top of the mountain cracked. It rumbled for a while as it fell open and off the mountain top, the sight only getting Rhea to smile more while Talia had a far more extreme reaction. No fucking way, she shouted as her eyes glowed more in excitement. Way, Rhea snickered. Now revealed to the world was a city nearly double the size of Olympus. With a grand archway at the top of the path, a city of marble and obsidian seemed to glow in the night. The buildings were built much like the designs of Anglo-Saxon Europe, but given archways and columns reminiscent of Greek times. The roadways were illuminated by solid light lamp posts as the paths curled in and up. The city had 3 divisions separated by a raise in elevation and a marking archway with a gate. The lowest and largest seemed to have the most space, with few homes and large storages for all kinds of supplies next to obviously free expanses of land meant for farming. Rhea even noted a large barracks built not too far from the main entrance, just far enough to not seem imposing over the entrance but close enough that any soldier could reach the gates in a few minutes, and from the larger observations towers along the roof, a ballista could easily be aimed at the entrance too. The next level in was built for residential districts and shops with multi-level buildings and raised pathways to reach higher buildings. Higher archways and paths on the roofs of some buildings also stood out as paths for soldiers and checkpoints, with the occasional watchtower for sentries. Lastly, on the top level were simple temples, but rather than built with designs to represent any one of their loyal gods or the protogonoi themselves, they remained mostly blank. Rhea knew that later one each temple would be converted later on and possibly more added to create a physical link for each new god aligning with them. Then, right in the center was the largest temple with several separate wings and even a tower topped with an observatory and garden in a large courtyard to the back. Rhea scanned over every inch as she hovered forward in the direction of the main temple. What is all this? Talia asked in awe beside her as the pair moved on. A parting gift left by Nyx and the others, Rhea answered as she looked at Talia. It was her idea and she made it in secret with the other previous protogonoi for us. Our own city to protect and care for, though I think we'll need to decorate a little more. And how did you know about it? Talia asked her curiously as she moved in front of Rhea and flew backwards without pause. Tartarus showed me the day after we formed the new council, she replied easily. And the main temple? Is that where we'll live? Talia asked while jerking her thumb backwards. No, Rhea replied while shaking her head. Think of it as the official HQ for our council. Our throne room and several offices are located there for us to receive reports and requesting needing our attention. Then where do we live? Talia asked with a frown. Don't you own the palace of the skies now? Rhea retorted, making Talia blush in slight embarrassment. Yeah, I guess I do, she replied sheepishly, but it only made Rhea giggle. Don't worry about it. There is more to it, but all I can say for now is that our personal home was built by Orinus and a certain gentleman, but we won't get it until a few more things are done. So don't go worrying about anything, we'll all be living together even though some of us will have our own separate spaces, such as you with your palace and Percy owning the House of Night. Cool, Talia hummed before the pair finally arrived over the temple before Talia whistled. Those are some big-ass chairs, she muttered while looking through a large window into the throne room and spotting the thrones, each measuring around 5 stories tall. Well, what did you expect? Rhea asked while eyeing Talia. Our godly height is 30 meters. I feel like we will accidentally step on people every now and then, Talia chuckled darkly before adding. Makes you wonder what they would do if they saw our divine forms. Well, aside from the fact that anything short of a god would be vaporized for just standing too close, let alone looking at us, and the fact that we'd each be as tall as Typhoon, I suggest you don't go assuming it, Rhea chided before adding. Remember what Tartarus told us. Lady Chaos made a strict ruling that no primordial may assume their divine form on a mortal realm, so unless in your palace or Tartarus, stick to godly or mortal form. I know, Talia said while raising her hands in surrender. The pair then descended until they arrived at the courtyard, the soft grass cushioning them as a cool breeze swept over the mountain. Talia followed Rhea as she walked forward to a large pond with a stone walkway laying over the still water to a little island in the center. This is it, Rhea said as she stopped at the border of the pond. Here looks good as any, Talia agreed before a sudden burst of heat drew their attention behind them to see a large portal of fire. Perfect timing, Rhea muttered as Layden, with a surprisingly new coloration, stepped through with the tree of golden apples held firmly within some of the coils of his neck. The dragon didn't mind them as he moved on a ways and deposited the tree gently down and laid down beside it while now turning his heads to look at them. I'm actually surprised Hestia could do it, Talia said as she looked at the dragon curiously but made no move to approach. Hey, Lady of Dragons and all that, Rhea said with a smile while feeling a swelling of pride over her daughter. Now I think we need to wait a few more minutes for Percy to be in place. I hope he hurries, Talia grumbled. What's the hurry? It's not like you're doing anything right now, Rhea said as she crossed her arms and looked at the younger goddess. I know, it's just that I'm antsy. Okay, Talia replied. I haven't been on Earth for years and I can't help feeling like a fight could start at any moment. Talia, the gods would be committing suicide if they attacked us here directly, Rhea reminded her. True, Talia sighed as she tried to relax before another flash of flames drew their attention to see Hestia having arrived as well. Hey there sweetie, Rhea greets warmly as Hestia approached before giving her a quick hug and then looking around. This looks nice, Hestia said while gesturing to the far walls of the courtyard made of marble and obsidian with a few solid light lamps around. Wait, you knew about this whole city? Talia asked incredulously. I only found out a few minutes ago. Well, you were too excited and ran off to check in on your palace when Tartarus showed a few of us. No worries though, Andromeda is still in the dark since she joined you, Hestia replied with a little snicker at the end. Great, Talia huffed while throwing her hands up in the air making both the other goddesses giggle at her. So how long do you think? Rhea asked Hestia. It shouldn't take long, Hestia replied with a shrug before looking at Layden. Rhea could have sworn the dragon was giving Hestia the closest thing it could to the puppy dog eyes with wagging tail and all, practically begging for her attention. It's odd that I find him slightly cute like that, Talia muttered as she looked at the dragon as well. Want to pet him? Hestia asked excitedly. Won't his scales scrape as though and poison us? Talia asked as she eyed the dragon warily. Nope, Hestia chirped. I made some changes to him when he became my sacred animal, so I took away the poison from his blood and saliva. What did you change it to then? Rhea asked curiously as the three goddesses walked closer to the dragon. His blood is now hot and acidic enough to melt even celestial bronze in a few minutes while he can breathe fire now, even Greek fire if you really piss him off, Hestia replied nonchalantly. I pity the idiot that tries to pick a fight with him, Rhea said as they got close enough to pet some of his heads. She marveled at how warm and smooth his scales felt now as the dragon purred contently making the ground shake slightly around them. D.A. Chapter 58. New Home IV. I pity the idiot that tries to pick a fight with him, Rhea said as they got close enough to pet some of his heads. She marveled at how warm and smooth his scales felt now as the dragon purred contently making the ground shake slightly around them. They remained like that for a few minutes simply chatting on trivial things and giving Layden some attention before they noticed a portal of darkness opening up not too far away. Rhea smiled as she approached it but then her eyes widened when her nephew shouted out of it. Her hand lashed in reflex as she stepped aside, catching Atlas by the scruff of his worn shirt stopping him dead. She then dropped him and waited as he got his bearings as he stood up. He towered over her at 8 foot but she wasn't the slightest bit intimidated especially when he finally noticed her and paled. I guess you feel my increase in power, she said offhandedly while resting her hands on her hips. So I believe you have some orders to fulfill. Aunt Rhea, he said through grit teeth before he slowly dropped to one knee and bowed his head. I swear myself, or as Atlas, to Lady Rhea on the sticks to serve, faithfully and without fail until she sees fit to release me. A loud thunder crack followed to sealing the oath, but unlike before, a green energy seemed to form a collar around Atlas' neck before fading into his skin. Looks like Styx's new higher authority on oaths is coming into play now, Rhea thought before she smiled as she rested a hand on her nephew's shoulder. I accept your oath, Atlas. Now stand, she ordered, and he did so before they all looked as his daughters came through the portal before it closed behind them. Man, everyone is showing up now, Talia commented as she and Hestia approached, making Atlas and his daughters start as they noticed yet another former heroine of Olympus before them radiating similar power to Percy. And now we have to get to our part, Rhea replied as they returned to the pond with the others following. Did they have wings before? One of the Hesperides whispered, making Rhea chuckle. They're markers for us, she replied while looking over her shoulder. Markers for what? Atlas asked as he then noted that Hestia had willed her wings to appear as well. For the new protogonoi, Talia answered with a wide grin at the stunned faces of Atlas and his daughters. Talia, Rhea said to get the girls' attention. Right. They both stood side by side as they faced the island centered at the pond. Together they took a deep breath before aiming their hands at the island and concentrating. Soon their hands started to glow their respective green and pale blue auras. Rhea could feel the shift of the earth and the ley lines of natural energy and power move in accordance to her will and centering at their mountain. The mountain started to tremble as the winds picked up around Talia with some storm clouds forming overhead. Then the island started to shake and crack as tendrils of white bark crawled out before fusing in the center. It started to form into a massive oak with a trunk nearly 6 meters across. Then thunder crackled overhead before lightning actually struck the tree but left no damage, if anything it seemed to help with the growth. Instead, with every strike the oak seemed to form veins glowing in colors of light blues and greens while the tree's branches sprouted golden leaves and the dirt at the tree's roots became as black as obsidian. While all that was happening, Rhea could feel an immense pressure begin to weigh down on the tree, but the oak remained firm in its growth as it took the burden of the skies. The storm remained around them as the tree finished growing to nearly 5 stories tall of magnificent white bark and golden leaves. After they finished, both primordial goddesses sighed as they dropped their hands to their sides. Talia then wiped her brow as she snapped her fingers to make a glass of nectar appear in her hands before downing the entire thing in one go. Stupid Olympians, Talia muttered as she snapped her fingers again to make the glass disappear. Having to fix a destabilized sky of all things. Well, now the earth and sky are reconnected properly, Hestia chimed as the other stepped closer to admire the tree. And it looks wonderful, a male voice said, making all whirl around to see Percy and Medusa having just formed out of shadow. It is pretty, Medusa added as she looked at the tree curiously before she glanced at the skies. He'll get here later, Percy said to her, probably knowing what Medusa was waiting for before he looked at the others. So, want to break in those thrones? He asked with a smirk. Lead the way, honey, Rhea said in a teasing tone as she and Hestia each took one of Percy's arms and started walking back into the main temple and completely ignoring the currently spluttering Atlas. They could hear the others following behind them as they walked, the large hallways illuminated by the celestial bronze torches that ignited as they got close and remained on while warming up the atmosphere around them. It took a few minutes until they arrived in the largest chamber, being large enough to house a football stadium with their currently plain thrones. Rhea heard the group behind them pause as she, along with Percy, Hestia, and Talia, kept moving forward to their thrones. With each step they started to group taller and taller, their footfalls soon becoming echoing booms causing a slight tremble to pass through the temple. Percy took the center throne with Hestia and Rhea at his left and right sides respectively, the backrests being especially thin along their backs to not bother their wings. As each primordial sat, their throne changed to their element or domains. Percy's became obsidian with cool mist and shadows seeping off it, whereas Ray's turned to emerald with depictions of nature carved into it. Hestia's became ruby with steam and even small bouts of fire coming off it. Talia's, on the other hand, remained as marble but gained carved depictions of storm clouds and literally crackled with lightning along the borders. As they sat, Rhea could feel their thrones become tied to their domains and become their focal points, filling each primordial god with energy, making them sigh contently while expanding their senses to the farthest reaches of their domains. Rhea still found it overwhelming at times being able to feel all life on and in the earth, even to the underworld, though Tartarus still belonged to its namesake god. She could only imagine what Percy and Hestia were feeling, the pair having equally extensive domains that were beyond physical representations, and judging by their focused expressions they were trying to organize all the input as well. She was broken out of her mussing through with several arrivals. Jason, showing that he did have his moments of flair for the dramatic, appeared in a strike of white lightning through one of the open windows, while Andromeda appeared in a poof of pink and purple smoke, making her cough slightly. Phoebe seemed to simply phase into existence while green water condensed in the air to form sticks. Nico appeared in a burst of hellfire. Yo! Percy greeted as the others walked to their thrones while growing to primordial heights of 100 feet and took their seats. Andromeda quickly moved to her throne, and upon sitting the throne it turned into a blue shade of opal with the slightest accents of pink and lavender. Jason's remained as marble-like Talia, but his seat glowed more, along with having white lightning trailing off the frame. Styx's throne turned into Stygian iron of all things, and Phoebe's became a sort of quartz if Rhea had to guess, but otherwise remained plain. Then all the seated protogonoi looked together to Nico as the boy stood before his throne and craning his head back just to look up at it. Percy and Jason tried to hide their slight snickers as Nico thought on a way to get around being human-sized and needing to sit on a throne reaching 5 stories in height. After a moment of scratching his chin, he snapped his fingers before closing his eyes and directing his hand at his throne. Rhea leaned forward curiously before she felt the slight shake and displacement of rock as marble steps formed from Nico all the way up to the seat of his throne. They all watched in silence as Nico took his time ascending the steps, looking perfectly relaxed until he reached the actual seat. Then with another wave of his hand, a new, properly sized throne formed on the seat of the actual throne, and Nico took a seat. He looked quite comfortable as he even crossed one leg over the other, laced his hands together before setting them on a knee, and turning his attention to the council, while sending a barely hidden glare at the still snickering Percy and Jason. Rhea herself giggled slightly at the sight of Nico sitting on a throne on another throne. All right then, Percy said once he reined himself in, thanks to Hestia poking at his side. So is everyone already assimilated to their thrones? He got a wave of nods before he continued on. Great. Now we have to actually get this city ready if we want our allies to move in and feel welcome. Oh. Before I forget, Hestia cut in as she waved her hand. At her command, a dip the size of a community pool formed in the center of the throne room with logs of white marble appeared. Then, in a roaring flare of power, a fire sprang into existence, immediately warming the entire chamber and the temple alike with the healthy glow of the nearly golden flame. Our hearth of home, Hestia said gently to the many smiles of the council. Percy leaned over and gave her a kiss of the cheek before returning his attention to the council proper. Back to making the gods feel welcome, we need set up a small temple for each god so they don't lose too much power once they renounce their ties to the West. Jason started up again while looking at Percy intently. Even the minor gods we already have allied to us will need it to safely separate from Olympus, otherwise they will be as defenseless as an Olympian coming here. I could handle setting up the smaller temples, Rhea offered, knowing that some of her fellow protogonoi had more pressing matters to attend tomorrow, whereas she only needed to be on the mountain and slowly enriching the nature around them. Sounds good, Styx spoke up before she glanced to Nico. And Nico, tomorrow we have our little project to work on. Agreed, Nico replied with a firm nod, getting several curious looks. No rest for the wicked, Talia sighed, getting a playful glare from her tiny cousin before she gave a more predatory grin. But once everything is set, the hunting begins. The others gave agreeing grins as their eyes seemed to glow with power before Percy chuckled, drawing attention to himself. Oh, trust me, Percy said as his grin broadened while his fangs seemed to grow, making him look feral. I've already been tracking my target, but first, I'm going to need my pack. DA, Chapter 59, Breaking Eye. She moved with purpose and intent, her nose constantly sifting through any and every scent in her search. Her pack followed close behind, their senses as strained as hers while a slight nervousness took them. Normally any display of weakness was brutally uprooted. They were the hunters, the strong. Unease and heavens forbid, fear, was to be suppressed at all times. However, even she could not keep the chill from her bones as they traversed the night with the new moon still hidden from all. She glanced up, her vibrant yellow eyes searching for the familiar celestial body, if only to be assured her longtime friend was watching them. But it didn't seem that the moon goddess was out with her chariot to guide the moon tonight, but then again, she wasn't too sure if her friend would have come help them. The years have been unkind to the goddess, and now with the loss of faith in the huntress and subsequent trust in her own pack, their friendly relationship had become strained at best. Nowadays Artemis was rarely kind to any and seemed to almost blame the very world for what has happened to her. She shook her canine head in disappointment, wondering when it was that her friend became so much like her father. A being so dependent on his pride and ego that he'd attack any who would look down on him in any way. Lady Lupa, one of her wolves called, breaking her out of her thoughts. The scent has become stronger. She sniffed again and noticed that the beta was right. The scent resembling that of wolf mixed with black orchid led them far north just past the US-Canada border. From the last she'd been able to get the smell at the site of the murder of Phoebe, and later a small divine signature left only a week ago with the kidnapping of Lady Hestia, Lupa had managed to pick up a trail near the Rockies and followed it north. The scent had only reappeared once she entered North Dakota and the divine signature had gotten stronger, putting her on edge. She'd heard from the hunters and gods about this, Umbra, or whatever it seemed to call itself. She would never admit it even under torture, but in her core, she was frightened. This wolf had not only gotten under the nose of Artemis and disappeared without a trace but then re-emerged only to take an Olympian before any could stop it. From what the hunters had told her, this wolf was actually smaller than her, being more or less the size of a large horse, whereas Lupa herself at full size was closer to that of a dump truck. She was a millennia-old goddess with combat abilities honed in the flames of war in both her forms, so then why was there a knot of cold fear in her gut? Something had changed in the air over a week ago and she could feel it all around her. Her own wolves seemed distracted themselves, as if being called to something else even though they had been born into her pack and sworn to her, and yet she could feel their loyalty beginning to sway, and worst of all she couldn't tell to what. It had happened before with Lysound, but that wretch of a wolf hadn't been sighted for over a year now. And here they were now getting to the borders of the West. Any farther and she would begin to lose her power until she was little better than a demigod in power. Lady Lupa, another, younger wolf, called to her. Something approaches. Lupa trained her ears around as her body tensed, soon hearing the sound of something indeed approaching along with the scent and divine power getting closer. She could hear not only brush but even leaves being disturbed, as well as feel a small tremble of the ground that just nearly escaped her noticed. Her heart quickened as the sound of trees actually groaning as they were pushed aside drew closer, marking the approach of something at least as large as her. But what worried her was that she couldn't hear any footfalls, which with something near her size should definitely be apparent. Her pack was poised at her sides, muscles locked and fangs bared even as their own hearts thundered in their chests. The very air seemed to become chilly as their breath became visible and thin sheets of frost formed on the trees in front of them. Her own ears flattened when she finally saw a figure walking towards them, its shoulders brushing against the top of the trees reaching up to 4 and 5 stories each. Then, as if disconnecting from the very shadows of the night, a wolf appeared before her and took her breath away. The wolf before her had to have the deepest black coat she'd ever seen, with some streaks of light blue, and underneath she could see the signs of lean and dense muscle. The massive wolf looked at them calmly with eyes looking like two blue orbs of pure ice, also containing intelligence and a sense of power, making several of her wolves step back in acknowledgement. Darkness and frost seemed to swirl around the wolf as well, with the forest behind it looking as if it had gone through winter, even as the ground underneath the wolf's paws began to ice over. By the proportions and the subtle undertones of a musky scent around the wolf, she could also tell this one was very much male, at that causing a whole host of problems. Truly, at times she hated and loved her instincts just like her current form. Thanks to fewer than 3 goddesses knowing she could actually take a human form along with her oath of chastity made it easy to avoid the cesspool of Olympian debauchery. Her wolf side also made it easy to ignore the few admittedly attractive males, godly and demigod alike, simply because they weren't like her. She was both a wolf and a goddess, and as such would not take anything less. Even the male shifters in her pack were seen more as adopted sons or nephews that always fell short of being strong enough to make her even considering them as more than just members of her pack. But right at this moment her wolf side was practically clawing at her mind to submit, but she stomped it down mercilessly with her goddess side. This wolf may be a specimen above any she'd ever seen, but if it was only a wolf and quite possibly the Umbra that she was hunting, then there was no point in considering him anything other than an enemy. So with that thought she let loose a snarl capable of making gods wet themselves, but the wolf didn't even look fazed. If anything, he looked amused as he scanned them each with a scrutinizing gaze before locking with hers. As their eyes remained on each other, the wolf took one step forward, this time doing nothing to repress the sound and pressure of the footfall, causing some of the wolves around her to jump back. Another step was taken and now she had to tilt her head back to look up at the wolf. Their stare-off lasted for several minutes before the larger wolf snorted and then surprised her by speaking in a deep voice with a growl undertone making her fur stand on end. So, Lady Lupa has graced me with her presence, he said as he stepped back slightly but was still no less imposing as he looked down at her. It took Lupa a moment to find her voice as she watched the wolf slowly turn to expose its side before he began to circle them, making her pack draw in closer to her. Who are you? She asked in a stern tone. You know who I am, he replied in a coy tone making her growl in warning. Feisty. I'm warning you, she said with narrowed eyes as she turned her body to make sure she was always facing the massive wolf as the forest around them shook with his every step. Don't play games with me. And yet I've been playing this game with you for years, the wolf replied with a chuckle. And the little huntress has never even come close with the little trails I left her for the fun of it. Umbra, Lupa growled as she bared her fangs yet again. The demon that murdered one of her hunters and took Lady Hestia. She was going to say more but that was all silence as the wolf released a growl that froze her in place. Her very bones in the forest alike shook at the strength and ferocity of it, her eyes glued to the gleaming white fangs just barely exposed to her as several of the wolves in her pack whimpered while lowering their heads. Her every instinct was screaming to her, wolf and goddess sighed alike, saying the same thing. Fight and die or run and live, if she had any hope of escaping that was. She tore her gaze away from the wolf that let go of the partial snarl and took in the sight around her as her body seemed to suddenly shiver from an unknown cold. As the wolf had walked around them, his every step had left behind some sort of black ice she'd never seen before, and that ice was now formed into hundreds of spikes too tall for her pack to jump. Her pack was corralled in now and she doubted she could get a window to try and jump the icy barrier while Umbra was a mere 10 or so meters away and capable of crossing that distance in just a few casual steps. What do you want? She asked after having given up on the thought of escape without a fight. Umbra paused in his pacing around them while looking up at the night sky as if looking for an answer. That depends, he finally answered as he looked at her again with those icy eyes. I want many things, some simple, others not so much. A peaceful future where I could raise a family safely is one, but that path crosses past rivers of blood and war. These rivers, if I have my way, will flow with ichor as I rip the Olympians apart. Is that why you've taken Hestia? She snapped while in her heart she began to worry for Hestia even more. Yes, he replied simply before she suddenly snapped and attacked. Like a runaway train she barreled at the larger wolf, her fangs gleaming as her claws came forward as well, only for her barely register some movement to then suddenly meet the ground in a resounding crash. She felt the pain only a second later on her side as she stared at the broken ground and ice in disbelief. She glanced at the wolf that was now facing her with one paw casually extended, gleaming black claws proudly displayed. It all happened in a split second and only now was it truly sinking in just how outmatched she was. Umbra had turned and swatted her back like a fly, and to add insult to injury, he had made sure to hit her with the pads of his paw rather than claws to not kill her outright. Quite the temper, Umbra said in a chiding tone as he rested his paw. But you did not let me finish, he said as he stepped closer as she struggled to her feet while keeping the pressure off her right foreleg. I took Hestia, but not against her will. What? She asked shakily as she tensed with the wolf's approach, her fear finally starting to show through. As I said, Hestia didn't want to be on Olympus any more than you would. D.A. Chapter 60, Breaking 2. I took Hestia, but not against her will. What? She asked shakily as she tensed with the wolf's approach, her fear finally starting to show through. As I said, Hestia didn't want to be on Olympus any more than you would. She couldn't help but snort at that comment. She hated the mere thought of being there on a visit, the damn gods always commenting on her form as unseemly for being a goddess. Mostly some of the drunken gods wishing she was human just so there was another ass to chase for them. If she could, she would have mauled several of them within days. You barely have any love for the other gods yourself, Umbra continued as he looked at her intensely, making her shuffle on her feet nervously. Tell me, why do you even serve them? She paused as she thought up a reason, her eyes furrowing in concentration. Why did she, truly? She had no love for the Olympians, spare for goddesses like Hestia and Artemis. But Hestia was gone and Artemis had distanced herself along with being in a frenzy along with most of the other gods ever since the hearth of Olympus was extinguished. It had been rekindled but now required constant attention and didn't carry the warmth it once had. As for most of the gods on Olympus, she could do fine without them. Hades, the world could better without their meddling, but the only other options were the titans and giants, and she knew that would screw over everyone. Still, she was grasping at straws for why to serve them, even though the word serve brought a bitter taste to her mouth. They'd done nothing to earn it other than threaten her when she first helped form the Romans. She was an attack dog to them and an overseer for the orphanage they dumped their spawn at and gave it a fancy name. At least her Romans proved resilient enough to grow and expand it themselves to form new Rome and barely needed interaction with the gods. Still, even if she had a soft spot for those demigods, it didn't mean she was happy with the role assigned to her. She was broken out of her thoughts however when Umbra leaned closer before speaking. Well, she shook her head before looking back at the large wolf. I serve to protect New Rome, she said but Umbra merely snorted. So you care for the demigods, but not the gods themselves. Umbra said with a wolf smirk. She wasn't sure how to reply to that, her ears lowering as Umbra gave a fanged grin. They left you with their messes time and time again, Umbra continued as he got closer and started pacing around her pack stepping back in fear of the more powerful wolf. You don't place the blame on the children but at the same time you question why you even try to help the gods. Her heart was racing as only her head turned to keep looking at the black wolf. In both recent wars you only ever participated to give New Rome a chance but there was no love spared for the Olympians. And you even hide your beauty in fear of what the gods would do to you should they discover it. How? She gasped as she stepped back as Umbra chuckled. Hestia told me, Umbra replied as he stopped before her, his face looming closer to hers. I know you want more than what your life is now, Lupa. You want to run free with your pack, to live in both forms and explore this world. Yet you cannot leave far from the wolf house if only on occasions of war and then it is only to watch as your pack loses its members while the Olympians remain fattening in their thrones. But the demigods would be far safer if the Olympians actually tried to care for and protect them. You and Terminus have done more for than your fair share and aren't even thanked for it, Umbra countered. So why stay if there is another option? And that would be? She asked softly, feeling like his eyes had pinned her down to the spot. Join us, Umbra said and continued before she could try to reject his offer. War is coming just over the horizon, but it is against the Olympians themselves. We have no quarrel with the demigods and do not plan on attacking them, however, should they attack us then we will respond in kind. He then backed up as Lupa looked at him, searching for deceit in his eyes, but found none. However she wouldn't let honeyed words tempt her so easily as she asked, then why kill that huntress years ago? I take it you know what those hunters are actually like, Umbra said with a voice drowning in contempt at the word hunters as Lupa nodded, having found the corpses more than once, several of them Roman boys she had personally helped before sending off to the camp. Then do you really think that hunter didn't have it coming? But what did she do that deserved that? She asked recalling the carcass she'd seen only days after the murder since none of the hunters had the stomach to approach their mutilated sister and Artemis having been too distraught to do anything either. That hunter helped in the murder of my mother and stepfather while also kidnapping my sister, Umbra replied with a bloodthirsty growl nearly making her whimper. She could see the hate and rage within his eyes as he said that and understood that he would love nothing more than to rip Artemis apart for it. That and the fact that she could see he was being brutally honest filled her with doubt about her distanced friend. However, one question was nagging at her head now more than anything. Just, who are you? There was silence for some time as she watched the wolf glance away for a moment to control his emotions. Once done he turned back to her and answered, you already know me Lupa. She was about to answer that she didn't but then was shocked to see shadows consume the wolf for all of 5 seconds before dispersing to leave a sight she didn't expect in her wildest dreams. Standing at 6 feet, 4, lean and muscular with a hooded coat made of darkness, black pants and tight shirt, 2 swords strapped at his hips, and eyes with literal, swirling black flames for irises and glowing icy blue pupils was Percy Jackson, the lost hero of Olympus. If she had been in her human form she would have pinched herself to wake up but she settled for biting her own tongue. She felt the pain, tasted the ichor, even shook her head again to try and disperse any mist that may be in effect but no, this was very much real. Hey Lupa, he said in a far more familiar but still deepened with maturity voice. Percy? She asked as she stepped closer to get a better look and even smell him. His wild hair was there, the familiar tanned skin, and his scent, though changed from sea breeze to the new black orchid, still held undertones that were undoubtedly him. It was all there and even his presence felt familiar but just barely. His presence had changed much, like an untold amount of power being held within one condensed point ready to burst. He may be human-sized now but she still felt like the smaller of the two. What happened to you? She asked. A lot, Lupa, he said as he tilted his head up to look at her before smiling softly. But I rather speak in a more level form. She understood what he meant and would have refused him, but for some reason, she felt the need to change, to do as he wanted of her. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the warmth in his eyes as he looked at her, maybe it was her newfound respect for him after having been bested so easily, or maybe it was the sheer presence and dominance that seemed to radiate off him. Regardless, she glowed in a golden light for a few seconds, but she noticed that he didn't look away or burn in any way. Once the glow died down, she slowly stood as to not lose her balance. She stood around 5 feet, 7, her hair the same reddish brown it had been as her fur cascading down her body to her shapely rear. Her olive-toned skin shivering slightly in the sudden chill of a breeze that swept over her. Her modesty being kept only by her own hair falling over her modest-sized breasts and crotch. She felt some color come to her cheeks when she noticed Percy's eyes giving her entire body a quick scan before returning to her face, and had to suppress the urge to try to cover her chest with her arms. Equals 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 equals. Don't forget to throw some power stones to keep the story going. If you want to support me or just to read ahead of the public release, you can join my Patreon. Patreon Moonhorse.